Tonight we enter the candlelit chambers of Tudor England, where velvet sleeves brushed against jewelled daggers, where prayer books lay open beside sealed warrants, and where the breath of a king could lift a woman to a throne or send her walking, pale and steady, toward the block. There are few names in the long chronicle of monarchy that still carry such a smell of iron as Henry VIII. He stands in the imagination like a great painted idol, broad-shouldered, red-bearded, swollen with feasting and authority, one hand resting upon a jewelled dagger, the other upon the ruin of those who loved him, served him, or dared to disappoint him. Around him move 6 women, each remembered not merely as a wife, but as a verdict: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. It is a schoolroom rhyme, cold and efficient. Yet behind those clipped words lie years of longing, terror, childbirth, diplomacy, faith, desire, betrayal, and the savage machinery of state. Why did he execute his wives? It is a question that seems simple only from a distance. The easy answer is cruelty. The deeper answer is more disturbing. Henry was cruel. Yes, but not in the manner of a man who believed himself wicked. He was cruel in the manner of a king who believed heaven had placed him at the centre of the world. He was cruel with lawyers, bishops, judges, musicians, spies, and clerks of the council. He was cruel under the painted ceilings of palaces, with scripture on his lips and dynastic fear burning beneath his skin. He was not merely a husband killing wives in fits of rage. He was a monarch transforming private disappointment into public treason. And here the brutal reality begins. In the courts of 16th century Europe, marriage was never only marriage. A royal wedding was a treaty written in flesh. A queen was expected to be beautiful enough to inspire devotion, noble enough to secure alliances, obedient enough to preserve order, fertile enough to produce sons, and silent enough to endure humiliation. Her body was a political frontier. Her womb was a national concern. Her manners were watched by ambassadors. Her words could be repeated by enemies. Her miscarriages became matters of state. Her friendships could be recast as conspiracies. Her past, even if ordinary, could be sharpened into a weapon. Henry inherited a throne still haunted by civil war. The Wars of the Roses had not vanished into romance. They had left behind broken houses, remembered betrayals, severed heads on city gates, and an uneasy kingdom that knew how quickly bloodlines could fail. The Tudor dynasty was young, almost experimental, glittering on the surface yet nervous at the root. Henry's father had taken the crown through battle and calculation. Henry himself came to power as a magnificent young prince, tall, educated, musical, athletic, and intensely devout. He was not born to be the monster of the portraits. He was praised as a Renaissance ruler, a golden king for a golden age. But gold, under pressure, can become a cage. From the beginning, Henry's reign was shadowed by one relentless demand: a legitimate male heir. Not merely a child, not merely a beloved daughter, a son, a prince who could carry the Tudor name without dispute. In a world where queens regnant were viewed with suspicion, where noble factions waited for weakness, where prophecy, lineage, and law tangled together in the minds of men, the absence of a son was not a private sorrow. It was a national alarm bell. Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, was no fragile footnote. She was the daughter of Spanish sovereigns, seasoned by hardship, dignified in adversity, and firm in conscience. For years, Henry loved and honoured her. She'd been his brother's widow, then his queen, then the partner of his youth. Yet her pregnancies ended again and again in grief. A daughter survived. Mary, intelligent and strong, but the Prince Henry desired did not live. As the years passed, Henry began to interpret biological tragedy as divine judgment. He searched scripture. He questioned the validity of his marriage. He listened to theologians, lawyers, and ambitious men who understood that the king's conscience was also the road to power. Then came Anne Boleyn. Anne was not simply the temptress of old legend, nor the innocent saint of later reaction. She was brilliant, sharp, stylish, politically alert, and dangerous because she knew the value of refusal. She did not become Henry's mistress in the old familiar way. She made desire wait. She made the king imagine not a passing pleasure, but a new queen. Around her gathered reformist ideas, courtly ambition, family advancement, and the raw electricity of a monarch accustomed to obedience who now found himself denied. For Anne, Henry overturned a world. He broke with papal authority. He reshaped the church in England. He demanded that subjects recognize him as supreme head on earth of the English church. Men of conscience, including the famous Thomas More and Bishop John Fisher, went to their deaths rather than submit. Monasteries trembled. Sermons changed. Oaths became tests of survival. The marriage to Anne was not merely a romance. It was a revolution sealed in chapel whispers, parliamentary acts, and the fear of execution. Yet Anne too gave Henry a daughter. Elizabeth was born healthy, bright, and red-haired, but she was not the long-awaited prince. More pregnancies followed and failed. The king's eyes wandered. Court factions smelled blood. The same forces that had raised Anne could be turned against her. By 1536, the woman for whom Henry had shattered Christendom in his realm was suddenly accused of adultery, incest, and treason. The charges were extravagant. They were also useful. To betray the king's marriage bed was not merely sexual misconduct. It could be framed as an assault upon the succession, a corruption of royal blood, a threat to the future of England. Men were arrested. Interrogations began. Words were twisted. Jokes became evidence. Courtly flirtations became crimes. Anne's own brother was drawn into the net. The legal process moved with terrifying speed. The queen who had once glittered at the centre of European attention found herself in the Tower, looking out across stone walls and river mist, preparing to die by a sword brought from France. Henry didn't kill all his wives. That is part of what makes the story so chilling. He could discard, annul, exile, or forgive when it suited his need. Anne of Cleves survived because political embarrassment could be solved by legal retreat. Catherine Parr survived because intelligence, caution, and timing helped her step away from the furnace before it closed around her. But Anna Boleyn and Catherine Howard were executed because each could be turned into a symbol of contamination. Each, in different ways, threatened the king's image of himself as God's chosen ruler, rightful husband, and father of an uncontested dynasty. Catherine Howard's fate was perhaps the most pitiful. Young, lively, and poorly protected by the very household that should have guarded her, she entered the orbit of an aging king hungry for renewal. Henry saw in her the mirror he desired, the illusion that he was still vigorous, still adored, still the sun around which beauty revolved. But rumours about her past and conduct spread through the court like smoke under a door. Once suspicion entered the royal chamber, mercy grew thin. Her youth did not save her. Her fear did not save her. The king's humiliation required sacrifice, and the state knew how to provide it. So the question is not only why Henry executed his wives, it is why a society allowed a queen's body, speech, memory, and desire to become evidence in a political ritual of destruction. The answer lies in power wrapped in holiness, in dynasty wrapped in marriage, in masculinity wrapped in law. Henry could imagine himself betrayed because he could not imagine himself inadequate. He could accuse because accusation protected him from shame. He could kill because the machinery around him made killing orderly, documented, witnessed, and legal. The scaffold did not stand outside civilization. It stood at its centre. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as the candles lower, tell me where you're watching from, and what the local time is in your corner of the world. To understand the man who would one day terrify palaces, councils, chapels, and marriage beds, we must first walk into a world where Henry was not yet a tyrant, not yet a monument of appetite, not yet the heavy figure of legend. We must enter the hush of royal nurseries, the cold corridors of guarded houses, the polished floors where tutors spoke Latin to children who were never allowed to forget that their blood belonged to England. Henry Tudor was born on the 28th of June, 1491, at Greenwich Palace, a place of gardens, river winds, pageantry, and watchful servants. The River Thames moved nearby like a silver road, carrying barges, messages, ambassadors, rumours, fishmongers, nobles, and priests. London breathed smoke and bells in the distance. The court, restless and glittering, turned its face toward the infant prince with interest, but not yet with destiny. Henry was not the first son, he was the spare child, not the immediate heir. His elder brother Arthur stood before him in the line of succession, bearing the name of Britain's legendary king, a name chosen to suggest providence, ancient glory, and the return of a golden island past. Henry's childhood was shaped by that shadow. Arthur was prepared for kingship. Henry, though still royal, was trained for a different path. Some have suggested that he may once have been intended for a high position in the church, though certainty remains elusive, as so much in Tudor childhood does. Still, his education was steeped in the learned world of Christian humanism. He was taught Latin, French, music, theology, rhetoric, and the noble arts expected of a prince. He learned to read not merely for pleasure, but for argument. He learned to perform intelligence, to display memory, to reason in public, to shine beneath the eyes of men who measured worth through speech and command. The young Henry grew into brilliance. Imagine him not as the immense king of later portraits, but as a bright flame of courtly promise, tall, fair-skinned, athletic, restless, graceful in dance, skilled with the lute, eager at tournaments, confident in conversation, in an age that admired princely magnificence. Henry seemed almost designed by fortune. He could ride hard, hunt long, sing well, joust bravely, and debate matters of faith with serious conviction. Those who met him in youth often described him with admiration. He possessed the great dangerous gift of charisma, that warm radiance by which power makes obedience feel like affection. Yet beneath all the splendour lay a dynasty still afraid of ghosts. The Tudor claim to the throne was not ancient in the way the Plantagenet claim had been. Henry VII, the father, had won the crown at Bosworth Field in 1485 after Richard III fell in battle. The red rose and the white rose and symbols of rival houses now were joined through marriage, and the new dynasty wrapped itself in the language of unity. But unity proclaimed is not always unity achieved. Many nobles remembered older loyalties, pretenders appeared, rebellion stirred. The realm had not forgotten how quickly kings could be made and unmade when blood, rumour, and ambition found each other. Henry VII understood this with the instincts of a survivor. He was cautious, calculating, severe with money, suspicious of overmighty subjects, and intensely aware that a throne rested not only on crowns and coronations, but on paperwork, bonds, marriages, spies, and fear. He had come from exile. He had gambled everything on invasion. He had won. But victory did not make him careless. In his court, Magnificence existed beside anxiety. Ceremony glittered, but account books mattered. Nobles smiled, but their debts were recorded. Beneath the cloth of estate lay the ledger. For the young Henry, this atmosphere must have been formative. He grew up among music and tournaments, yes, but also among the invisible disciplines of survival. He saw that monarchy required performance. He saw that legitimacy had to be announced again and again through marriages, heirs, ceremonies, portraits, prayers, alliances, and punishments. He learned that a king must be loved, feared, and believed. Above all, he learned that royal blood was never merely personal. It was public property, sacred symbol, named political weapon, and national insurance. And death changed everything. In 1502, Arthur died at Ludlow, not long after marrying Catherine of Aragon. He was only 15. The boy named for legend vanished into the earth, and the spare prince became the future of the Tudor line. Suddenly, Henry's life narrowed and expanded at once. He was no longer a brilliant younger son with space to dazzle. He became the vessel of expectation, the family's survival, the kingdom's peace, and the dynasty's future settled upon him like a mantle woven from gold and lead. The death of Arthur also left behind a question that would one day shake Europe. Catherine of Aragon, Arthur's young widow, remained in England, caught between Spanish diplomacy, Tudor calculation, money disputes, and theological uncertainty. Could she marry Henry? Had her first marriage been consummated? Was such a union permitted by divine law, or only by papal dispensation? At the time, such questions could be managed by negotiation. Years later, they would return like buried blades. Henry came to the throne in 1509 when he was not yet 18. The old king was dead, and England greeted the son with hope, where Henry VII had been guarded and cold. Henry VIII seemed generous, glamorous, open-handed, and alive with princely confidence. Bells rang, pageants unfolded. The young king married Catherine of Aragon, binding himself to dignity, Spanish prestige, and the lingering designs of his father's diplomacy. The early rain felt like spring after a long winter. Courtiers expected a ruler of chivalry, faith, victory, and splendour. Henry wanted greatness, not modest competence, not quiet administration. Greatness. He wanted to be a warrior king, a learned king, a defender of Christendom, a prince praised in foreign courts and sung in English halls. He looked across the Channel toward France, that old theatre of English ambition. He looked toward the church, where doctrine and kingship intertwined. He looked toward history and imagined himself standing among the mighty. His mind was not small. His hunger was not ordinary. Even his piety had grandeur in it, a conviction that God watched kings with special attention. This is essential. Henry did not begin as a man opposed to the old religion. He was deeply Catholic in training and instinct. He heard Mass, honoured relics, read theology, and took pride in orthodoxy. In 1521, he would be celebrated for attacking the ideas of Martin Luther, earning from the Pope the title Defender of the Faith. That title mattered to him. It stroked not only his vanity, but his sense of sacred identity. Henry believed words, sacraments, vows, and divine law were real forces in the world. His later violence cannot be separated from this belief. He did not cast aside conscience. He bent conscience into a throne. The young king's court shimmered with controlled danger. Tournaments were not simply games. They were ritualized warfare, displays of masculine honor, noble hierarchy, and royal vigor. Hunting was not simply sport. It was the royal body moving through landscape as master of beasts and men. Feasting was not simply indulgence. It was political theatre, the distribution of nearness to majesty, music, clothing, jewels, armour, prayer, and dance all formed a language. Henry became fluent in that language, and for many years he spoke it beautifully. But there was a wound hidden inside the golden image. The Tudor dynasty required sons. Henry knew this from childhood. He knew what civil war had cost. He knew how fragile a new royal house could be. He knew that a dead prince could change the fate of nations overnight. Arthur's death had made him king. Another absence might unmake everything his father had built. So, in the young Henry, we find the seeds of later catastrophe. A charming prince taught that kingship was sacred. A second son turned suddenly into the only hope. A learned ruler who believed theology could decide politics. A man of performance, applause, and appetite. A dynasty born from battle, terrified of extinction. A husband whose private life would never truly be private. The boy raised for splendour had inherited not merely a crown, but a fear. And fear, when seated on a throne, does not remain quiet for long. Catherine of Aragon entered Henry's life carrying the gravity of kingdoms. She was not a decorative bride sent across the sea to smile in jewels and disappear into tapestries. She was the daughter of powerful monarchs, raised in the stern brilliance of a Spanish court where faith, conquest, dynasty, and ceremony braided together into one unbreakable cord. She had watched her mother govern. She had known the language of diplomacy before many girls of noble blood were permitted to speak with confidence. She came to England with a purpose carved into her name: alliance, legitimacy, prestige, and the promise of children who would bind island and continent in royal flesh. By the time she married Henry, Catherine had already endured humiliation and uncertainty. She had been a widow in a foreign land, caught between courts that argued over money, dowry, honour, and usefulness. For years she had lived not quite as princess, not quite as queen, not quite free, not quite secure. Her servants suffered shortages. Her position shifted with the weather of diplomacy, yet she endured. That endurance would define her life. Beneath the embroidered sleeves and calm public face was a woman of formidable inner steel. When Henry married her in 1509, the union seemed blessed by brightness. He was young, golden, admired. She was dignified, experienced, and royal in a way that strengthened his own uncertain dynasty. Their coronation unfolded with splendour. London rejoiced in pageantry, banners, music, and the intoxicating hope that accompanies a new reign. The young king and queen appeared as a living promise. Their bodies, their prayers, their bedchamber, and their unborn children seemed to belong not only to themselves, but to the future of England. In the first years, there was affection. Henry trusted Catherine. He honoured her. He admired her intelligence and piety. When he travelled to war in France, Catherine remained in England as regent, and during that time the Scots invaded. At Flodden Field in 1513, English forces defeated and killed James IV of Scotland. Catherine, heavily involved in the defence of the realm, sent Henry news of victory. She understood queenship as labour, not ornament. She had ruled in crisis. She had answered danger with command. Yet even great dignity could not protect her from the arithmetic of childbirth. The Tudor court waited for pregnancy as farmers waited for rain. Every swelling of the queen's belly carried the weight of prophecy. Courtiers watched her complexion, her appetite, her movements, her attendance. Bells stood ready. Linen was prepared. Chapels filled with prayer. Astrologers might murmur. Physicians might advise. Women of the chamber moved through private rooms with solemn urgency. The Queen's body became the most observed landscape in England. Catherine conceived multiple times, but joy repeatedly turned to mourning. A daughter was born too early and died. A son, Henry, Duke of Cornwall, lived for only a short time, though his birth ignited wild celebration. Bonfires blazed. Bells rang. The kingdom tasted relief. At last, it seemed, the Tudor line had a male future. Then the infant died, and celebration curdled into dread. Other pregnancies ended in loss. Some children were stillborn. Some lived only briefly. Each tragedy left no modern medical explanation that Henry could accept as random misfortune. In a world saturated with providence, repeated loss demanded meaning. Catherine's surviving child, Mary, was born in 1516. She was healthy, intelligent, and cherished, at least for a time. Henry could be proud of her. She received a princely education. She had the blood of Tudor and Spain, yet she was a daughter, and in Henry's mind, a daughter could not quiet the old terror. England had known powerful women, but it had not known a universally accepted queen ruling in her own right. The memory of civil conflict remained close enough to breathe. The king feared that if he died, leaving only Mary, rival claimants and ambitious nobles might drag the realm back toward faction and bloodshed. Here we must pause within the silence of Catherine's chamber. Imagine the queen after another failed pregnancy, the thick curtains, the smell of wax and herbs, the women speaking softly, the priests praying nearby, the small wrapped body removed from sight, beyond the door, the kingdom waiting for official words. Beyond the kingdom, ambassadors sharpening their reports. Catherine, devout and disciplined, would have understood grief as a trial sent by God, but she was also human. She had carried those children. She had felt movement beneath her ribs. She had prepared names, futures, ceremonies, perhaps even private hopes she never confessed aloud. The political crisis was also a mother's wound. Henry's wound was different. It was not deeper, but it was more dangerous. He began to see his lack of a living son not only as sorrow, but as a sign. The marriage itself became suspect in his mind. Catherine had first been married to his brother Arthur. The union between Henry and Catherine had required special permission from the Pope, because church law treated marriage to a brother's widow as forbidden unless dispensed under particular reasoning. Catherine insisted firmly and repeatedly that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated. This claim mattered. It meant her union with Henry was lawful in body and spirit. Henry had accepted it for years, but time alters the meaning of old facts when desire and fear begin to work upon them. Henry turned to Scripture, especially the ancient command that seemed to warn against taking a brother's wife. He convinced himself that God had punished him by denying him sons. The argument allowed him to transform a dynastic crisis into a matter of conscience. This was not only convenient, it was psychologically powerful. A man who believed himself favoured by God could not easily accept that chance. Biology, or male fertility, might be involved. It was easier to imagine divine displeasure than personal limitation. It was easier to question Catherine than question himself. The cruelty of this transformation lay in its slowness. Catherine had given him decades of loyalty. She had crossed seas for England. She had endured widowhood, hardship, pregnancy, grief, and public scrutiny. She had served as queen with honour. Yet gradually, Henry's gaze shifted. The woman who had once embodied alliance and legitimacy began to appear in his mind as the obstacle between England and safety. Her age mattered. Her fertility was fading. She could no longer offer the son he craved. Her daughter Mary stood as living proof that the marriage had produced a royal issue, but not the kind Henry believed history required. Around the king gathered men who understood the opportunity. Some were reformers of religion, some were servants of ambition, some were legal minds who could turn royal anxiety into argument. A king's conscience was never merely private when courtiers could rise by guiding it. The question of marriage moved from bedchamber to council table, from whispered frustration to formal inquiry. Scholars were consulted, Universities were pressured, bishops debated, envoys travelled, papers multiplied. The intimate history of a husband and wife became an international crisis. Catherine refused to yield. Her refusal is one of the most powerful acts of the Tudor age. She did not accept retirement into quiet disgrace. She did not agree that her marriage had been sinful. She did not surrender her daughter's legitimacy to make room for another woman's child. Before a court at Blackfriars, she knelt before Henry and appealed to him in public, reminding him of their long marriage, her virginity when she came to him, and the justice of her cause. Then she withdrew, refusing to recognize the authority of a process she believed corrupted by the king's desire. In that moment, Catherine became more than an unwanted wife. She became a barrier between Henry and the version of destiny he demanded. For Henry, this was intolerable. He could tolerate grief when it could be contained. He could tolerate delay when it promised eventual victory. He could tolerate theological complexity when scholars might be bent toward his conclusion. But Catherine's conscience stood like stone. She was not rebellious in the crude sense. She did not raise troops or call for revolt. Her weapon was legitimacy. Her presence said that Henry was wrong. Her dignity said that his desire did not alter truth. Her daughter's existence said that the future could not be rewritten without violence to memory. And so the missing heir became more than a child who had not survived. He became an absence around which England was forced to turn. That absence changed theology, marriage law, diplomacy, and the fate of every woman who entered Henry's orbit. It fed suspicion. It inflamed pride. It made fertility a test of divine favour and obedience a condition of survival. Catherine's tragedy was not that she failed as queen. It was that she succeeded in every way except the one her world valued most brutally. She was noble, faithful, learned, courageous, and politically experienced. She gave Henry a living child. She defended England. She upheld her conscience against one of the most forceful monarchs in Europe. Yet her body did not produce a surviving son, and in the merciless language of dynasty, that absence eclipsed a lifetime of service. The missing heir was not merely missing from the cradle. He was missing from Henry's imagination of safety, and because that imagined son did not live, real women would suffer in his shadow. Anne Boleyn entered the Tudor court like a spark falling upon dry rushes. She was not the most conventionally beautiful woman in Europe, at least not according to every witness. But beauty in a royal court was never a simple matter of symmetry. It was movement, intelligence, timing, scent, silence, glance, withdrawal, and the ability to make powerful men feel that the world had become sharper in one's presence. Anne possessed that dangerous magnetism. She had been educated in continental courts, where manners were polished to a bright edge and conversation could wound more deeply than steel. She returned to England with French style, refined speech, quick wit, dark eyes, and a command of attention that made her unlike the softer women Henry had known. She understood performance. In the chambers of the court, where tapestries muffled footsteps and every smile had witnesses, Anne moved with calculation and heat. She could dance with elegance. She could speak with confidence. She could laugh at the right moment, retreat at the better one, and refuse in a world where refusal had its own intoxicating power. Men who had long taken female availability for granted found her difficult to possess. Henry, accustomed to success in love as in ceremony, discovered that desire sharpened when denied satisfaction. This denial transformed everything. A mistress could be enjoyed and then dismissed with gifts. A queen had to be made. Anne did not accept the old pattern of royal convenience. She did not become a quiet ornament in the king's private pleasures, whether from ambition, caution, religious conviction, family pressure, personal pride, or some mixture impossible now to separate. She made herself unavailable unless Henry offered the crown. The king's infatuation deepened into obsession. Letters written in his own hand reveal a man unsettled by longing, a ruler lowered into hunger, waiting for replies, pleading for affection, promising constancy. The king who commanded armies found himself asking to be loved. Yet Anne's rise was not a private romance sealed away in perfumed rooms. It was a political weather change. Her family advanced. Her allies multiplied. Her enemies watched. Old noble houses measured the danger. Foreign ambassadors reported each tremor of the king's attention. The queen's ladies, the council, the bishops, the courtiers who depended upon royal favour, all understood that Anne was becoming more than a woman desired by the king. She was becoming the centre of a possible future. To support Anne was to gamble. To oppose her was also to gamble. The long effort to end Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon became entangled with Anne's presence. The king wanted legal clarity, spiritual justification, and public obedience. But beneath all these solemn terms beat a more urgent pulse. Anne was young enough to bear children. Anne might give him the son his first marriage had not secured. Anne, therefore, became not merely beloved, but necessary. In Henry's imagination, she stood between present frustration and dynastic rescue. This is where desire became doctrine. The break with Rome was not born from a single cause, nor can it be reduced to one woman's charm. England was already touched by currents of reform, humanist scholarship, anti-clerical resentment, financial temptation, and political debates over royal authority. Yet Henry's marital crisis gave those forces a door through which to enter history. The Pope would not grant the solution Henry demanded, partly because Catherine's powerful imperial family could not be ignored. Legal proceedings stalled, appeals dragged, diplomacy failed, patience curdled. Henry, who believed himself a sacred king, came to resent the idea that any foreign authority could stand between him and what he called justice. The argument hardened. If the king was responsible before God for the governance of his realm, why should the Bishop of Rome possess final power over English law and English marriage? If Scripture supported Henry's case, why should papal politics delay obedience to divine truth? If England was a sovereign kingdom, why should its king kneel for permission? Such questions were not only theological, they were explosive instruments of statecraft. Men with sharp minds and colder instincts saw that the king's desire could become a revolution. Thomas Cranmer, Thomas Cromwell, and others would help shape the path. Parliament, once summoned, could turn royal will into statute. Bishops could be pressured. Oaths could be required. Language could be refined until disobedience sounded like treason. The machinery moved slowly at first, then with increasing confidence. What had begun as a quest to dissolve one marriage became a restructuring of spiritual authority in England. Anne stood near the centre of this transformation. She favoured evangelical thinkers. She owned religious books. She protected reform-minded clergy. She listened to sermons that criticised corruption and emphasised Scripture. To some, she appeared as a godly queen in waiting, a woman through whom the English church might be cleansed. To others, she was a heretic, a seductress, a witch-like influence who had bewitched the king and endangered the souls of his subjects. The same qualities that made her fascinating made her vulnerable. A woman with ideas was more threatening than a woman with jewels. A woman who influenced doctrine and appointments invited hatred not only from rivals, but from those who believed the sacred order was being violated. In January 1533, Henry and Anne married secretly. She was already pregnant, or believed herself to be so. An urgency pressed upon every decision. By spring, Cranmer declared Henry's marriage to Catherine invalid and his marriage to Anne lawful. In June, Anne was crowned queen with extraordinary ceremony. London witnessed processions, pageants, silk, cloth of gold, heraldic beasts, and public displays of dynastic hope. Yet crowds do not always love what they are ordered to celebrate. Some watched in silence, some murmured for Catherine, some saw Anne's coronation as triumph, others saw it as sacrilege. Anne entered Westminster Abbey robed in magnificence, but the stones beneath her feet were older than Tudor need. They had seen kings rise, kings fail, vows made, vows broken, bodies buried, and prayers whispered into darkness. She must have felt the enormity of the hour. The daughter of a courtier now bore the crown of England. Her enemies could not deny her elevation. Her allies tasted victory. Henry looked toward the child in her womb with expectation so intense it must have filled the air like thunder before rain. The child was born in September 1533. A girl, Elizabeth. The disappointment was immediate, though managed with public language. The planned celebrations for a prince were altered. Documents had to be corrected. The king and queen insisted that sons would follow. They had reason to hope. Anne was still young. One daughter did not mean failure, yet the birth of Elizabeth placed Anne in a dangerous pattern. She had gained everything by promising, openly or silently, what Catherine had not given. Now she too had produced a daughter. The difference was that Anne had far more enemies, and her position rested upon a more recent, more controversial foundation. Every queen needed time. Anne had less of it. Her temperament, once thrilling, became a liability. Henry had admired her sharpness when it opposed others. He could resent it when it turned toward him. She was not naturally submissive. She argued. She showed jealousy. She intervened in patronage. She demanded recognition for her daughter. She carried the strain of a woman surrounded by hostile observers, required to embody triumph while knowing that a single failed pregnancy could reopen every wound in the kingdom. The court that had once watched her ascent now watched for cracks. The religious upheaval deepened. Those who refused to recognize Henry's supremacy faced ruin or death. Oaths divided families. Monasteries came under scrutiny. Sermons carried political meaning. Even silence could become suspicious. Anne's queenship existed in this atmosphere of fear and transformation. She was praised from some pulpits, cursed in private houses, flattered by servants, mocked by enemies, and judged by the invisible tribunal of fertility. Then came further pregnancies, uncertain reports, hopes raised and broken. In such moments the Queen's body again became public territory. Was there quickening? Was the child male? Had God blessed the union? Had the king been right? Every physical event carried theological consequence. If Anne bore a son, the new order would shine with validation. If she did not, doubts would multiply. Her enemies needed only patience. The tragedy of Anne Boleyn lies partly in the speed with which triumph became peril. She helped alter the religious and political map of England, yet the very scale of that alteration made her survival dependent upon success. She was not merely Henry's second wife. She was the living justification for a broken marriage, a humiliated first queen, a disinherited princess, executed conscience men, and a kingdom forced into obedience. So long as she might bear a son, she was precious. The moment that hope faltered, all the cost of her rise could be counted against her. Henry had risked too much to accept embarrassment quietly. A king may forgive a mistress for failing to satisfy him. He may tire of a favourite and send her away. But a queen who has become the reason for revolution cannot easily be allowed to become ordinary. Anne had been made into a symbol of renewal, divine approval, and Tudor continuity. If she failed in that symbolic role, she could be remade into something darker. That is the brutal rhythm of Henry's court: exaltation first, then scrutiny, then disappointment, then accusation. For a time, Anne still glittered. She sat in chambers bright with cloth and candlelight. She listened to petitions. She protected allies. She wore the jewels of queenship. She watched her daughter's future with fierce maternal interest. But around her, the air had changed. Those who had bowed low were calculating how deeply they needed to bow tomorrow. Those who hated her waited for a sign from the king. Those who served her knew proximity might become dangerous overnight. Anne Boleyn changed everything because she represented the impossible promise that desire, law, religion, and dynasty could all be forced into harmony by royal will. But human bodies do not always obey politics, and when the womb failed to confirm the king's certainty, the crown began to seek another explanation. The destruction of Anne Boleyn did not begin with the sound of the axe. It began in rooms where men spoke softly. In Tudor politics, catastrophe often entered through the side door, not as thunder, not as open rebellion, but as rumour, memorandum, private interview, sealed instruction, and the sudden cooling of a royal smile. A courtier might notice who was invited to supper. A secretary might observe which papers were copied twice. A lady might hear a careless phrase near a window. A musician might be summoned, questioned, and never quite return to the life he had known. The royal court was not simply a household. It was a listening machine. Anne Boleyn lived inside that machine. By the spring of 1536, the atmosphere around her had become thin and dangerous. The king had turned his attention toward Jane Seymour, a woman whose appeal seemed almost deliberately opposite to Anne's. Jane was quiet where Anne was sharp, pale where Anne was dark, modest where Anne was dazzling, and cautious where Anne had been bold. Such contrasts mattered in a court that interpreted personality as destiny. Those who resented Anne could now praise Jane as humility restored. Those who feared the Queen's influence could imagine a replacement who would not disturb them. Those hungry for advancement understood that a changing royal desire could become a ladder, but desire alone was not enough. To remove a queen who had been crowned, anointed, and recognized by law required more than boredom. It required a reason. An annulment might be attempted, but Anne had powerful implications attached to her. Her daughter Elizabeth's legitimacy, the authority of the church settlement, the honour of the king, and the credibility of recent years all hung together like weights on a single chain. A simple separation could raise awkward questions. Why had England been broken from Rome for a marriage now quietly discarded? Why had men died for refusing oaths tied to a union the king no longer desired? Why had a crowned queen failed so soon? A darker solution had a brutal elegance. If Anne was not merely disappointing but guilty, then Henry was not a mistaken husband. He was a deceived sovereign. If Anne was adulterous, then the lack of a son was not a divine warning against Henry, but evidence of hidden corruption around him. If Anne had conspired with lovers, then the king's humiliation could become righteous anger. If she had wished or imagined his death, then her fall could be framed not as marital failure, but as treason. The machinery needed evidence. In such courts, evidence could be discovered, stretched, arranged, frightened into being, or made useful by interpretation. This does not mean every person involved understood himself to be lying. Power has a way of creating its own weather. A nervous witness may exaggerate to survive. A servant may repeat gossip as fact. A minister may hear what he knows the king needs heard. A council may treat impossibility as plausibility once the direction of royal will becomes clear. Truth in the Tudor state was not an abstract jewel resting beyond reach. It was often a document with a seal upon it. Thomas Cromwell stood at the centre of this gathering storm. He was one of the most formidable political operators of the age, a man of law, administration, finance, and intelligence. He could build systems out of royal appetite. He understood paper as power. He knew how to transform uncertainty into procedure. Under his hand, the Tudor state became sharper, more intrusive, more capable of reaching into monasteries, estates, courts, and private consciences. In the Queen's crisis, his role remains debated, and still for the most part, secrets remain hidden. Yet there is no doubt that the investigation moved with a precision that suited his gifts. The first crucial arrest was Mark Smeaton, a musician of lower status than the great courtiers around Anne. His position made him vulnerable. He had access to the Queen's circle, but not the protection of noble blood. Under interrogation, he confessed to adultery with Anne. Whether he was tortured remains uncertain, but pressure did not need to leave visible wounds to be effective. A man facing the wrath of the state, isolated from allies, confronted by officials, and aware that denial might prolong terror, could be broken by fear alone. Smeaton's confession opened the gate. Other men were drawn into the accusation. Henry Norris, a gentleman of the Privy Chamber and long trusted by the King. Sir Francis Weston, young and courtly. William Brereton, whose inclusion may have reflected older political calculations in the Welsh marches. And George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, Anne's own brother, whose alleged involvement transformed scandal into something monstrous. The charge of incest gave the case a special horror. It made Anne not merely unfaithful, but unnatural. It stained blood itself. The accusations were excessive, even by the standards of a suspicious age. The alleged meetings depended on dates, movements, and opportunities that modern scrutiny has often found deeply doubtful. Yet the point of such charges was not careful plausibility in the modern sense. Their function was moral annihilation. The Queen had to be made unthinkable. She had to be separated from sympathy. If she were only unwanted, people might pity her. If she were only infertile, they might remember Catherine. But if she were lustful, incestuous, and treasonous, then her death could be presented as purification. Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. The Tower was not merely a prison. It was a theatre of royal power built in stone. Its walls held memories of noble captives, murdered princes, treason trials, and the cold patience of monarchy. To pass through its gates was to enter a space where time slowed, and hope became disciplined. Anne had entered the Tower once in triumph, preparing for coronation. Now she returned under guard, her world collapsing around her. Accounts of her behaviour in confinement reveal a mind under terrible strain. She spoke in bursts. She asked after her mother, her brother, the accused men. She laughed strangely, wept, prayed, protested innocence, and tried to understand the shape of the trap. Her words were watched and recorded. Even grief became material for officials. Even fear could be copied into reports. This is one of the cruelties of the Tudor fall from favour. The accused person became a source against herself. Meanwhile, the trials moved forward. The men accused with Anne were condemned. The machinery of conviction did not pause because evidence was fragile. Treason trials in this world were not balanced contests between state and subject. They were rituals in which the outcome often stood waiting behind the curtain. Juries knew the temperature of the king's desire. Judges understood expectation. Nobles sitting in judgment knew that hesitation could be remembered. To acquit those whom the crown had marked was to step dangerously close to suspicion. Anne and George were tried by their peers. The hall would have been heavy with ceremony, rank, and dread. Words of law sounded beneath carved beams. Men who had once spoken politely with the Queen now sat to judge whether she had betrayed the king's bed, bloodline, and life. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, presided as Lord High Steward. Family did not save her. In Tudor politics, kinship could become another instrument of discipline, and defended herself with composure, or so tradition suggests. She denied the charges. She stood not as a fainting victim, but as a queen insisting upon her truth. Yet her truth had no power against a state that had already chosen its story. She was found guilty. The sentence was savage, as sentences for treason often were. Burning or beheading lay within the king's power to decide. Henry chose beheading and, with a strange refinement of cruelty, ordered an expert swordsman from Calais rather than the common axe. This detail has fascinated generations. Was it mercy, vanity, ritual, elegance, a desire to make the death of a crowned queen swift and controlled? Perhaps all of these. Perhaps Henry, who could command her death, still wished the spectacle to reflect his own magnificence. Even execution could be curated. The men died first. One by one, they were taken to the scaffold and killed. Their deaths cleared the final path. Anne remained in the tower, waiting through delays that must have stretched each hour into torment. The uncertainty of timing was itself a punishment. She prepared for death repeatedly, only to be told it would not yet come. Imagine the body's exhaustion. The prayers begun again. The courage gathered, spent, and gathered once more. Outside, London breathed. Barges moved on the river. Markets opened. Bells sounded. Life continued with obscene normality while a queen counted her remaining breaths. On the morning of her execution, Anne dressed with care. She spoke to the small crowd with controlled dignity. She did not confess guilt. She did not attack the king. She praised him in the formal language expected of one dying under royal authority. Some have interpreted this as fear for her daughter, others as political intelligence, others as the discipline of a woman who understood that the scaffold was not a place where truth could easily triumph. To die well was the final performance available to her. The swordsman stood ready. Anne knelt. There are moments in history that seem to grow quieter the closer one approaches them. The stone, the cloth, the low murmur of witnesses, the pale neck, the blindfold, the prayer. The sword moving so swiftly that death arrived almost before the body could understand it. With that stroke, the queen was removed from the world, but the machinery had done more than kill a woman. It had rewritten a reign. Henry became the injured husband. Cromwell became the servant who had uncovered corruption. Jane Seymour could move toward marriage cleansed by contrast. Elizabeth became illegitimate. Anne's supporters scattered into silence or danger. The court learned once more that intimacy with the king was not protection. It was exposure. The execution of Anne Boleyn shows the brutal genius of political violence when law, rumour, desire, and fear combine. No mob dragged her to death. No assassin struck in a corridor. She was destroyed by commissions, indictments, witnesses, verdicts, and official language. Her ruin was made orderly. It was filed into the memory of the state, and that is perhaps the most chilling truth of all. The scaffold was only the final instrument. The real weapon was the process. Jane Seymour came to Henry not as lightning, but as shelter, in the strange theatre of the Tudor court, where every gesture might be measured and every colour might speak. Jane appeared almost like a deliberate answer to a king exhausted by turbulence. She was not presented as a glittering intellectual companion, nor as a woman of biting wit, nor as a figure wrapped in the dangerous brilliance of religious argument. Her power lay in stillness. She offered calm. She offered modesty. She offered the appearance of obedience at a moment when Henry had begun to associate female boldness with humiliation. This was not weakness. At court, softness could be strategy. Silence could protect more effectively than speech. A lowered gaze could conceal ambition. The Seymour family understood the movement of opportunity as well as any noble house in England. Jane's brothers, Edward and Thomas, were alert, well-placed, and eager for advancement. Around Jane gathered men who knew that a king's desire might lift an entire family into greatness. She was not alone. No queen ever was. Behind the pale face and folded hands stood kinship, calculation, and the patient hunger of those who'd watched others rise and fall. Jane's appeal rested partly on contrast. She could be imagined as chaste where others had been called suspect, humble where others had been accused of pride, gentle where others had seemed combative. Whether this image truly reflected her inner life is harder to know. The Tudor record rarely grants women the full privacy of personhood. It gives us portraits, reports, judgments, and symbols. Jane became a symbol almost as soon as Henry chose her. She was the good woman, the obedient woman, the woman who would heal the king's wounded honour and restore the sacred promise of the royal household. Henry married her with astonishing speed. The court barely had time to breathe between death and wedding. The black cloth of one queen's destruction had hardly settled before another woman stepped into the perilous brightness of royal marriage. To modern feeling, the swiftness appears brutal, almost obscene. Yet in dynastic politics, hesitation was dangerous. Henry wanted a wife. More importantly, he wanted a son. The kingdom needed a queen who could make the succession appear clean again. Jane Seymour's body was immediately placed under the old expectation, the old scrutiny, the old national hunger. Her first challenge was not childbirth, but survival within the memory of those displaced. Catherine of Aragon's daughter, Mary, still lived under the shadow of illegitimacy and paternal displeasure. Jane showed sympathy toward Mary, or at least allowed herself to be associated with efforts to restore the king's elder daughter to favour. This was delicate ground. Mercy could please. Mercy could also offend. To speak too strongly might suggest criticism of the king's past decisions. To remain entirely cold might damage the new queen's image of gentleness. Jane moved with caution, and Mary eventually returned to court, though only after accepting her father's supremacy and the invalidity of her mother's marriage. Reconciliation came at the cost of conscience. Here the emotional world of Henry's family becomes almost unbearably complex. A daughter humbled, a former marriage erased, a dead woman recently condemned, a new wife expected to embody peace, a king who wanted forgiveness without admitting fault. The palace didn't heal by tenderness alone, it healed by submission. Those who returned to Henry's warmth did so by stepping across language that had been arranged for them by power. Jane's queenship was brief, but it mattered. She did not reshape England's church in dramatic intellectual terms. She did not blaze across diplomatic correspondence with the same force as some other royal women. She did not leave behind a long record of political intervention. Yet she occupied the one space Henry valued above all others in that season of his life, the promise of legitimate male succession. Everything about her image encouraged hope. Her motto, often rendered around obedience and service, fit the role she had been made to play. Her public identity softened the king's recent violence, making his household appear restored, purified, and ready for blessing. Then, in 1537, the long-awaited pregnancy came. The news must have moved through the court like warmth through chilled stone. Physicians grew attentive. Ladies of the chamber prepared. Prayers multiplied. The king watched, no doubt with a mixture of anticipation and dread. He had known hope before. He had celebrated a son before. He had buried expectation under the weight of infant death. This pregnancy did not belong to Jane alone. It belonged to everyone who feared uncertainty, everyone who wanted advancement under the Seymour star, everyone who desired the stability of a male heir, and everyone who understood that Henry's temper might shift if heaven once again denied him. In October, Jane entered confinement at Hampton Court. Royal confinement was a world apart, heavy with ritual and darkness. The windows were covered, the chamber was warmed, tapestries shut out draughts and daylight. Women attended the Queen, male physicians waited at the edge of permitted access. Religious objects, prayers, relic habits of older devotion, and the anxious rhythms of childbirth filled the room. Outside those walls, men who ruled the kingdom could do almost nothing. The future of England had passed into a chamber of women, blood, pain, linen, sweat, and whispered command. Labour was long and difficult. For all the authority of kings, childbirth remained one of the great uncontrollable thresholds of the early modern world. It mocked rank. It ignored treaties. It reduced queens and peasant women alike to flesh in extremity. The pain came in waves. The room smelled of wax, herbs, damp cloth, and fear disguised as procedure. The women around Jane had seen birth before. They knew when hope was steady and when danger began to enter the room. Hours stretched. The kingdom waited beyond closed doors. At last, the child was born. The son, Edward. The emotional force of that moment is difficult to overstate. Henry had what he had long desired, a living male child, born within a marriage recognised by his own church and court, cradled as the future of the Tudor line. Bells rang, fires were lit, messengers rode, prayers of thanks rose from chapels. The king's years of anxiety seemed, at last, to have been answered. Jane had done what no wife had successfully done for him. She had delivered a prince who lived. In that instant she became sacred in Henry's memory. Not sacred as a theologian might define it, but sacred in the emotional mythology of a king. She had produced the son. Her identity fused with fulfillment, whatever her personality had been in its fullness, whatever ambitions she had possessed, whatever fears she had swallowed. History began to flatten her into the mother of Edward VI. This is one of the quieter cruelties of royal women's lives. Even success could erase them. Jane was celebrated not for the range of her human self, but for the child her body gave to the dynasty. Then the shadow came. Jane fell ill soon after childbirth, whether from infection or complications that modern medicine might have treated. Her condition worsened. The joy of the prince's birth became mingled with dread. The same palace that had rung with triumph now listened for signs from the Queen's chamber. Fevers in that age carried a terrifying authority. They advanced behind flushed skin, weakness, delirium, and the helplessness of physicians whose knowledge could name danger more easily than defeat it. Henry, who had discarded one wife and executed another, now faced a different kind of loss. Jane was not resisting him. She was not shaming him. She was not failing him. She had given him what he wanted most, and death was taking her anyway. This was a kind of power he could not command into silence. Jane Seymour died on the 24th of October, 1537. Her death was immediately reshaped into legend. She became the beloved wife, the true wife, the one who had given the king a son and then vanished before conflict could stain her image. Henry would later choose to be buried beside her, a decision that has helped preserve the idea that Jane held a special place in his heart. Perhaps she did. Perhaps he loved her in the way Henry could love, through possession, gratitude, need, and memory. Perhaps her early death protected her from the disillusion that consumed others. A dead queen could not argue. A dead queen could not disappoint. A dead queen who had borne a son could be perfect forever. This perfection was useful. The Tudor court could now speak of Jane as the model of queenship. Her obedience, her fertility, her softness, her maternal sacrifice all formed a mirror in which later women would be judged. The message was clear without needing to be carved in stone. A queen should serve, submit, bear a son, and leave no disorder behind. Jane's tragedy became Henry's comfort. Her death allowed him to mourn without admitting guilt. Her success allowed him to imagine that his long struggle had been justified. But beneath the incense of memory lies a harsher reality. Jane Seymour's elevation shows that Henry did not execute wives simply because he tired of them. He could cherish, or claim to cherish, a woman who satisfied the dynasty. He could wrap a queen in reverence when her body gave him a male heir. This does not absolve him. It reveals the terms of his mercy. Jane survived the king's suspicion not because the world was gentle to her, but because death claimed her before politics could. She fulfilled the one demand that had devoured so much of Henry's conscience and patience. She became, in his eyes, proof that the fault had not been his. The prince in the cradle seemed to vindicate him. The marriage seemed blessed. The Seymour family rose. The kingdom breathed, though not without unease. Yet even in celebration, fragility remained. One infant boy now carried the hopes of a realm that had already learned how quickly heirs could die. The Tudor future was not secure. It was sleeping in a nursery. Jane's body was laid to rest with honour. The court dressed in mourning. Prayers were said. Ceremonies unfolded. The king withdrew, grieving, perhaps sincerely, perhaps also grieving for himself, for the long years of fear finally relieved and instantly darkened by loss. The son lived. The mother was gone. The bargain seemed almost biblical in its severity. In the end, Jane Seymour's story is not peaceful. It is quiet, but not peaceful. It is the story of a woman made into an answer, the answer to Henry's shame, the answer to dynastic panic, the answer to courtly faction, the answer to a kingdom demanding a prince. And when she died, the answer became untouchable, embalmed in gratitude, protected by absence, and polished by the king's need to believe that at least one of his marriages had been righteous. In the candlelit mythology of Henry's reign, Jane stands clothed in white, but the white is not innocence alone. It is linen. It is childbirth. It is mourning. It is the pale colour of a queen who gave England a son and paid for it with her life. Anne of Cleves arrived in Henry's story as a diplomatic solution wrapped in winter roads, foreign cloth, and dangerous expectation. She came not from the intimate web of English court flirtation, but from the colder calculations of European power. Her marriage was not born from poetry, nor from the sudden heat of a king watching a woman across a chamber. It was arranged in the language of alliances, confessional anxieties, envoys, portraits, treaties, and the restless balance of a continent divided by faith. England stood uncertain among larger forces. Catholic powers might unite. Protestant alliances might prove useful. A bride from Cleves offered political possibility, and in the language of monarchy, possibility could be made flesh. The king had not seen her. That fact alone placed the whole enterprise upon fragile ground. Royal marriage often depended on images, reports, lineage, and negotiation. But Henry was a man who trusted his own response as though it were a form of judgment. He liked to believe that his eyes revealed truth. If he desired, desire itself could become evidence of divine favour. If he recoiled, revulsion could become reason. The danger was obvious, though not everyone wished to name it. A bride chosen by diplomacy would still have to please a man who had long confused attraction with destiny. Hans Holbein was sent to paint her. The portrait became one of the most consequential images in Tudor history. Holbein was no crude flatterer. He was a master of controlled presence, a painter of faces that seemed to breathe behind stillness. His image of Anne presented dignity, composure, elaborate dress, and a calm, frontal gaze. It did not shout seduction. It offered rank, order, and suitability. To officials, it was enough. To those who needed the marriage to proceed, it was more than enough. A painted face crossed borders more safely than a living woman, and Henry agreed to the match. But no portrait can capture the weather of a meeting. Anne travelled toward England through discomfort and ceremony. She left her familiar lands, her language, her household customs, and the rhythms of a court she understood. She entered a country where every glance would measure her. Her clothing might be mocked, her manners might be misunderstood, Her silence might be judged stupidity. Her hesitation might be read as coldness. She was walking into a marriage with a king whose past should have frightened anyone paying attention. Imagine the passage. Muddy roads, inns prepared with haste, noble escorts, cold air against the face, the sound of horses and wheels, the smell of damp wool, leather, smoke, and river mist. Messages riding ahead. Curiosity gathering in English towns. At each stage, Anne drew nearer not merely to a husband, but to a role for which she had been chosen by men who would not suffer the consequences as she would. Henry, impatient and theatrical, decided to surprise her. He rode to meet Anne in disguise at Rochester, indulging an old chivalric fantasy in which true love recognizes the beloved beneath costume and ceremony. This kind of romantic masquerade suited the younger Henry's imagination. He expected wonder, admiration, perhaps immediate emotional recognition. But Anne did not know him. She had not been trained in the private games of the English court. When the disguised king entered, she responded without the awe he expected. She failed to recognize majesty hidden under play. For Henry, humiliation burned quickly. A man secure in himself might have laughed. A king less trapped by vanity might have allowed the awkwardness to pass. Henry did not. He felt rejected before he had properly begun. The encounter wounded the fantasy he had built around the marriage. From that moment, his mind turned against her. He would later complain of her appearance, her smell, her body, her manners. Whether these complaints reflected truth, wounded pride, or the need to escape a politically inconvenient match hardly matters. In Henry's world, the king's displeasure could become reality. Anne was suddenly in danger, though she may not yet have understood how grave that danger was. The formal wedding took place in January 1540. Ceremony moved forward because diplomacy had momentum. Treaties had been made. Public honour was at stake. To stop everything at the last moment would expose English policy to ridicule. So Anne became queen, though the king already wished himself free. Her marriage bed, usually the centre of dynastic hope, became the stage of a different drama: disgust, avoidance, and the politics of non-consummation. Henry claimed he could not consummate the marriage. This claim served him well. If no consummation had occurred, legal escape became easier. The problem could be framed not as the king's failure, but as a mismatch, a deception, perhaps even a providential sign. Once again, intimate bodily experience became a matter of law. The royal bed was transformed into testimony. What had happened, what had not happened, what the king felt, what the queen understood, and what servants might infer all became pieces in a puzzle designed to produce freedom. Anne's survival depended upon reading the room with extraordinary speed. She might have resisted. She might have insisted on her rights as queen. She might have called upon her family's honour, challenged the king's claims, or demanded recognition. But resistance would have required allies strong enough to protect her, and she had few in England. Her foreignness isolated her. The political alliance that had brought her was already losing value. The minister most associated with the marriage, Thomas Cromwell, was himself becoming vulnerable. The ground under Anne's feet was opening. She chose submission. This choice has sometimes been mistaken for passivity. But in the deadly environment of Henry's court, yielding could be an act of clear intelligence. Anne agreed to the annulment. She accepted the argument that the marriage had not been validly completed. She did not force Henry to destroy her reputation through more violent accusation. She gave the king what he wanted most: release without embarrassment so severe that blood became necessary. In return, she was treated generously. Anne received estates, income, and the title of the king's beloved sister. This phrase, strange and almost theatrical, allowed Henry to recast the failed marriage as familial affection rather than political disaster. She remained in England. lived comfortably, and maintained a dignified presence. She even developed cordial relations with the royal family, in a court littered with broken women and silenced voices. Anne of Cleves became the rare wife who walked away from Henry with land, status, and her head still upon her shoulders. Her success lay in recognizing that victory was impossible, but survival was not. The cost of survival was public surrender. Anne had to accept that her queenship would be erased almost as soon as it had begun. She had to endure whispers about her attractiveness, her body, her ignorance of English ways, and the king's rejection. She had to watch another woman move into the dangerous space she had vacated. She had to live as a former queen in the land where she had been unwanted by her husband. Yet she lived, in Tudor terms. This was no small triumph. The fall of Cromwell sharpened the lesson. The man who had helped arrange the Cleves marriage was arrested in 1540 and executed. His enemies had gathered force. The failed match damaged him badly, giving his opponents a weapon. Cromwell, who had shaped so much of Henry's religious and political transformation, discovered that service to the king did not guarantee safety. A minister could rise through brilliance and fall through a single misjudgment, especially when that misjudgment touched the king's pride. Anne watched from the safer side of obedience. Her annulment also reveals something essential about Henry's violence. He did not always need blood. When a woman yielded quickly, when her removal did not require her moral annihilation, when her family did not pose immediate danger, when the king's honour could be repaired without scaffold spectacle, he could show a kind of practical mercy. But this mercy was not softness, it was convenience. Anne was spared because sparing her served the story Henry preferred to tell about himself. The story was simple. He had been misled. The marriage had not truly taken root, and all parties now accepted a peaceful correction. Beneath that story lay bruised vanity. Henry had wanted to be desired. He had wanted the disguised king to be recognized by instinct, as though majesty shone even through costume. He had wanted the portrait to become flesh without disappointment. He had wanted diplomacy to obey appetite. When reality failed him, he recoiled with the fury of a man who believed inconvenience was an insult. Yet Anne gave him no useful rebellion. She didn't become the villain he might have needed. Her calm compliance denied the machinery of accusation its richest fuel. There is a quiet dignity in that. Anne of Cleves has often been treated as comic relief in the grim sequence of Henry's marriages. The unwanted wife, the portrait bride, the lucky escape. But such simplicity diminishes her. She crossed seas into uncertainty. She faced rejection by one of Europe's most dangerous husbands. She navigated a legal dissolution in a foreign realm. She survived the collapse of the minister who had promoted her match. She built a stable life from humiliation. She outlived the king. Her story is not comic, it is a study in adaptation. Among the many women drawn into Henry's orbit, Anne understood the most basic truth of power. Pride must be given a door through which to exit. If a king feels trapped, he may break the walls. If he is offered a graceful escape, he may reward the hand that opens it. Anne opened that door. She surrendered the crown to keep her future. In the palaces where she later lived, one imagines a different rhythm from the suffocating intensity of queenship. State accounts, household music, visitors, news from court, occasional ceremonies, the strange freedom of no longer sharing the king's bed. She had entered England as a pawn in an international game, but she remained as something more unusual. A woman who had survived being unwanted. And survival, in Henry's England, could be its own crown. The king's wound to pride did not kill her. Her wisdom, caution, and timing kept the scaffold at a distance. Catherine Howard entered the royal household like spring brought too close to a furnace. She was young, lively, graceful, and surrounded by people who understood the value of youth in a court ruled by an aging king. Her laughter mattered. Her dancing mattered. Her skin, her dress, her manner of lowering her eyes, her ability to appear delighted by attention, all of it mattered. She came from the great Howard family, a house of old nobility, ambition, Catholic sympathy, and deep experience in courtly survival. Yet Catherine herself was not a seasoned political creature in the way older observers might have wished. She was a girl carried into a world where every smile could become evidence, and every secret could one day demand blood. Her early life had not been guarded with the care expected for a future queen. She grew up in the household of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, where noble blood did not necessarily mean strict supervision. Great households were crowded, noisy, layered communities of relatives, servants, musicians, tutors, gentlewomen, and young men with access to corridors that should have been watched more carefully. In such spaces, discipline could be uneven, privacy was porous, authority was distant, desire, curiosity, flirtation, pressure, and exploitation could flourish under the same roof as prayer and pedigree. This is crucial to Catherine's tragedy. She was not raised as though she might one day become queen. Her past, therefore, was not shaped for the terrifying scrutiny that queenship would bring. There had been youthful entanglements, perhaps coercive in some cases, perhaps confused, perhaps affectionate, perhaps reckless, and certainly dangerous once they were dragged into the full light of royal investigation. The names Henry Manox and Francis Derham would later become attached to her like hooks. What had once belonged to the hidden disorder of adolescent life became, in the logic of Tudor power, a matter of treason, purity, and dynastic contamination. When Catherine appeared at court, Henry was no longer the golden prince of tournament fields. His body had become a prison. Pain, weight, age, frustration, and memory clung to him. He had known disappointment, rebellion, failed marriages, political executions, religious upheaval, and the bitter discovery that command could not restore youth. Then Catherine came into view, bright and fresh, and the king felt the old fantasy stir again. Not merely lust, renewal. A young woman's attention could make him imagine himself restored. This is one of the saddest and most dangerous illusions in the history of power. An aging ruler may seek youth not only for pleasure, but as confirmation that time has not conquered him. Catherine's presence told Henry what he wanted desperately to believe, that he could still inspire devotion, still be desired, still stand at the centre of beauty. Those around him encouraged the dream. Courtiers praised her charm. The Howard family saw opportunity. A marriage to Catherine could shift influence at court, perhaps softening the religious direction of policy, perhaps restoring older aristocratic power against reformist rivals. The girl became a banner before she had the strength to hold a pole. Henry married her in 1540. He adored her, or adored the image he made of her. He showered her with gifts. He called her his rose without a thorn, a phrase so polished and dangerous that it seems almost cruel in hindsight. A rose without a thorn is not a real flower. It is an expectation. It is beauty without defence, pleasure without difficulty, womanhood without history. Henry wanted Catherine to be untouched by complexity. He wanted her to be innocence made flesh. But no human being can safely live inside another person's fantasy, especially when that person is king. Catherine's queenship unfolded in an atmosphere of luxury and surveillance. The court moved through palaces, chapels, hunting lodges, gardens, and banquet halls. Music sounded, candles burned, velvet swept across rush-strewn floors. Yet beneath the glitter lay the old system of watching. Ladies watched ladies, servants watched doors, men watched favour, families watched advantage. The Queen's household, far from being private, was one of the most dangerous public spaces in England. Catherine seems to have enjoyed the pleasures of rank, jewellery, dancing, attention, and the thrill of being elevated must have had a powerful effect on someone so young. She had been lifted astonishingly high, yet she also made choices that placed her in terrible danger. She appointed Francis Derham, a man from her past, to her household. Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman close to the king, became dangerously associated with her. Secret meetings, letters, and intimacy, whether fully sexual or not, created exactly the material her enemies needed. The court did not need certainty in the modern sense. It needed a story that could be proven enough. Rumours reached Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. The information first concerned Catherine's past, not necessarily her conduct as queen. For Cranmer, the matter was explosive. If Catherine had entered marriage with a previous contract or sexual history concealed from the king, the marriage itself might be questioned. If she'd continued improper relations during queenship, the issue became darker still. The king's honour, the succession, and the legitimacy of the royal bed were once again drawn into crisis. Henry was initially resistant to believing it. This resistance reveals how deeply he had invested in Catherine's image. He had wanted her innocence to be true because it made his own fantasy true. To accept accusation was not simply to judge her, it was to face humiliation. It meant that the old king, rejoicing in a young wife, might have been deceived, mocked, or pitied. For Henry, shame was never allowed to remain shame. It had to become punishment. The inquiry widened. Catherine's past was excavated with ruthless attention. Women from the Dowager Duchess's household were questioned. Old conversations resurfaced. Childhood chambers became crime scenes of memory. Servants recalled who had entered which room, who had whispered, who had exchanged gifts, who had used words of promise. The past, unstable and half-hidden, was forced into the rigid shape of legal danger. Catherine's youth did not protect her. Instead, it made her more easily overwhelmed by the machinery closing around her. Francis Derham was arrested. Thomas Culpeper was examined. The Queen's ladies were drawn into scrutiny. Every path led toward exposure. The difference between sin, foolishness, coercion, youthful ignorance, and treason collapsed under pressure. Tudor law could be precise when it wished, but royal anger blurred categories. The essential question became not simply what Catherine had done, but what her actions had made Henry feel and what danger could be imagined from them. A queen's chastity was not treated as private virtue alone. It was a political seal. The king's bed was the guarded source of legitimate heirs. Any uncertainty around the queen's sexual conduct opened a nightmare of disputed blood. Even if Catherine never bore a child, the theoretical possibility mattered. If a queen could deceive the king in the chamber, then the dynasty itself could be poisoned at the root. This fear gave personal betrayal the language of national emergency. Catherine was confined. The young woman who had danced at the centre of attention now found herself surrounded by silence, orders, and terror. Reports suggest that she became distraught, even frantic. She was not Anne Boleyn, formed by years of political struggle and sharpened by intellectual combat. Catherine seems to have been less equipped for the full violence of state accusation. Her grief and panic feel closer to the bone. One imagines her crying out in corridors, begging to see the king, unable to believe that the world of gifts and music had transformed so quickly into imprisonment. Henry withdrew into rage and misery. There is something grotesque in his sorrow. He had placed Catherine upon a pedestal, and then treated the collapse of that pedestal as an injury done chiefly to himself. His wounded pride became the centre of the kingdom's attention. He had been dishonoured. He had been deceived. He, the king, the lord of law and church, had been made vulnerable by a young woman's hidden history and reckless attachments. To restore order, Catherine had to be stripped of the image he once gave her. The rose without a thorn had to become a corrupted thing, Parliament moved to secure the legal ground. Catherine was condemned by Act of the Tainder, a process that avoided the uncertainties of a full trial. This was law used as a blade already pointed toward its victim. The state did not need to risk public contest, complicated testimony, or a queen speaking in her own defence before a dramatic audience. The decision could be clothed in parliamentary authority. The result was the same. The scaffold waited. In February 1542, Catherine Howard was taken to the Tower. The winter air must have carried a cutting cold from the river. The stones of the fortress received another queen accused of sexual treason. Yet Catherine's tragedy has its own texture. Anne Boleyn had been a political force whose fall shook doctrine and succession. Catherine Howard was younger, less prepared, and more plainly swallowed by a system that treated her body as a royal instrument. Her past may have involved genuine foolishness. It may have involved manipulation by older men. It may have involved both. But the punishment belonged to a world far more interested in the king's honour than in the girl's vulnerability. On the scaffold, Catherine died with Lady Jane Rochford, who had helped arrange or conceal meetings with Culpeper, and who herself had lived long enough to be caught in a second queenly catastrophe. The axe fell. Another wife of Henry VIII was gone. Catherine Howard's execution was not simply the punishment of adultery. It was the destruction of a fantasy that Henry had needed too much. He had tried to clothe age in youth, pain in beauty, and shame in desire. When the illusion broke, the young queen became unbearable to him. Her death allowed him to convert humiliation into justice, weakness into authority, and heartbreak into spectacle. Yet beneath the official language, a human figure remains. A girl raised carelessly, a young woman rewarded for pleasing powerful eyes, a queen watched by enemies and used by family ambition, a body praised, possessed, investigated, condemned, and erased. Her story is not merely scandal. It is a warning about what happens when youth is placed before power and told that charm is protection. Catherine Howard didn't live long enough to become the woman she might have been. History remembers her through accusation, desire, and death. But somewhere behind the documents, behind the confessions, behind the frightened testimony and the cold language of treason, there was a living voice, quickened by music, afraid in confinement, and lost inside a court that never forgave women for being human. The body of Henry VIII became one of the great dark landscapes of Tudor history, not merely because it grew vast, not merely because the fine athletic prints of early memory became the broad, suffering, irritable monarch of later portraits. His body matters because in a kingdom ruled by personal monarchy, the king's flesh was never only flesh. It was symbol, instrument, theatre, weapon, and prison. When Henry's body changed, the mood of the realm changed with it. Pain entered the council chamber. Impatience sat on the throne. Private agony became public danger. The young Henry had once been celebrated for physical grace. He rode, hunted, danced, wrestled, shot, and jousted with the confidence of a man who believed strength was a sign of favour. In the culture of kingship, bodily vigour carried moral meaning. A strong king seemed a blessed king. A handsome king seemed a natural ruler. A prince who could master a horse, split a lance, and shine in tournament armour appeared capable of mastering nobles and enemies. Henry understood this deeply. His body was part of his argument for power. Tournaments especially mattered to him. They were not casual amusements. They were ritualized dramas of violence, identity, and masculine display. Beneath banners and painted shields, men performed courage before the court. Armour flashed in the sun. Horses struck the earth. Lances shattered. Trumpets called. Ladies watched from galleries, their presence turning combat into courtly theatre. A king who excelled there appeared almost mythic. A warrior lover, a Christian knight, a living emblem of nobility. But such displays carried risk. In 1536, Henry suffered a major jousting accident. He was thrown or crushed beneath an armoured horse, and for a time he was believed to be in grave danger. The details remain debated, as so many Tudor medical moments do. Yet the consequences echo loudly. His leg, already troubled, became a source of chronic suffering. Ulcers opened, wounds refused to heal properly, movement became difficult, pain returned and returned, no respecter of rank. Chronic pain changes the weather of the mind. It narrows patience. It sharpens anger. It humiliates the proud. For a man like Henry, who had built so much of his identity upon movement, command, and physical magnificence, the decline must have been spiritually corrosive. He could still be king. He could still command executions, marriages, laws, bishops, armies, and estates. Yet he could not command his own leg to cease its torment. He could not command the swelling of his body to reverse. He could not command time to restore the prints in the mirror. The wound smelled, according to some accounts, and required draining. Imagine the private chambers where attendants approached with cloths, basins, ointments, and controlled expressions. The king's body, sacred in ceremony, became a site of leakage and infection. Servants saw what subjects could not. Physicians handle the flesh that ambassadors described only through rumour. The man who insisted upon majestic distance had to submit to treatment, touch, discomfort, and the embarrassment of dependence. Food became part of the story. The Tudor elite ate richly when rank allowed it. Meat, pies, wine, preserved fruits, thick sauces, sweet dishes, and ceremonial abundance filled noble tables. For Henry, whose movement decreased as his pain increased, appetite became more dangerous. His weight grew dramatically. Armour made for him in later life reveals a massive body, far from the agile form of youth. The belly expanded, the face thickened, the legs weakened. Mounting a horse required assistance. Movement through palaces became a logistical matter. A king's immobility alters politics. When a ruler cannot move easily, access becomes more valuable. Those who control doors, chairs, documents, schedules, and bodily care gain hidden influence. The privy chamber, already central to power, becomes even more significant. A whispered word near the king's chair may matter more than a speech in council. A servant who catches the king in pain may see decisions forming under conditions no formal record will confess. Illness makes governments intimate. Henry's moods darkened. It would be too simple to say pain made him cruel. He had already shown ruthlessness when strong, but physical decline intensified the conditions under which cruelty flourished. Suspicion, vanity, fear of mockery, rage at contradiction, and the desire to be obeyed instantly all thrive in a body that feels besieged. When a monarch is in pain, disagreement can feel like insult, delay can feel like conspiracy, bad news can feel like betrayal. Some have wondered whether head injury affected Henry's personality. The jousting accident may have involved unconsciousness or trauma, and modern observers sometimes speculate about changes in impulse control, aggression, or emotional instability. Such theories remain uncertain. We cannot place a Tudor king beneath modern instruments. We cannot perform scans upon vanished flesh. Still, the question itself reveals how strongly his later behaviour seems connected to bodily crisis. The king who once enjoyed spectacle became increasingly capable of sudden suspicion and unforgiving violence. Yet we must be cautious. To explain Henry through injury alone would be too merciful and too narrow. Many people suffer pain without destroying others. Many age without turning humiliation into law. Henry's body was one factor within a larger structure of power. What made his suffering terrifying was the political world around it. Pain in a peasant might be endured in a cottage. Pain in a king could become policy. His private distress had clerks, prisons, judges, and executioners at its disposal. The body also transformed Henry's relationship to masculinity. In his youth, masculinity had been performed through sport, sexual confidence, martial ambition, music, and courtship. In later years, as his body failed, he asserted mastery in other ways, through command, through orthodoxy, through punishment, through the humiliation of those who disappointed him, through marriages that promised renewal, through a growing insistence that loyalty must be absolute, spoken, written, sworn, and proven. This is the tragedy of a man who could not bear diminishment. Aging comes to every body, but kings are trained to resist ordinary limits. They are surrounded by people who flatter the impossible. A courtier's world depends upon telling power what it wishes to hear. If the king limps, men praise his strength. If he grows heavy, painters arrange majesty in width and fabric. If he rages, servants call it righteous indignation. If he desires a young woman, the court smiles and declares him beloved. Reality bends around the throne until the ruler may lose the habit of meeting truth directly. Portraiture helped preserve the illusion. The famous image of Henry standing wide, massive, jewelled, frontal, and unchallengeable is not a confession of weakness. It is propaganda of presence. The legs planted apart, the shoulders enlarged by clothing, the eyes fixed outward, the hands commanding attention. He appears less like a man than an institution wearing flesh. Yet this painted strength conceals fragility. The width that impresses also burdens. The richness that dazzles also distracts. Behind the image stands a body in decay. Court ritual had to continue around him. Foreign envoys still came. Petitions still arrived. Parliament still met. Religious policy still convulsed the realm. Nobles still competed for access. But increasingly, all of it revolved around a monarch whose body carried unresolved agony. This helps explain the peculiar menace of his final decade. The king was not merely older, he was cornered by himself. The walls of flesh had closed around a will accustomed to open space. His leg wound became almost symbolic. An ulcer is a break in the surface, a place where the inside refuses to remain hidden. Henry's reign, too, was full of such openings. Beneath the gold lay fear. Beneath theology lay appetite. Beneath marriage lay succession panic. Beneath law lay revenge. Beneath majesty lay a man who could be embarrassed, rejected, wounded, and terrified of failure. The body betrayed what ceremony tried to conceal. Kings are mortal. But mortality made Henry more dangerous, not less. As the end approached, the question of succession sharpened. Edward was alive, but still a child. Mary and Elizabeth remained complicated figures, restored in line by statute, but carrying the scars of legitimacy battles. Religious factions looked toward the future. Conservatives and reformers wondered which side would dominate when the old lion died. Every cough of the king might be interpreted. Every illness stirred calculation. Every sign of favour could shape the next reign. The aging Henry knew people were waiting. Perhaps not openly, perhaps not disloyally, but they were waiting because all courts wait for mortality. The thought must have enraged him. He, who had demanded that England bend around his conscience, would one day become a corpse around which others arranged policy. He could not stop this. He could only command while breath remained. That knowledge may have made obedience feel even more urgent. A dying king often clutches authority harder because he feels it slipping. His final years were marked by suspicion toward men once trusted. Ministers could fall. Nobles could be destroyed. Religious conservatives and reformers alternately rose and trembled. The court became a place of shadows, where factions watched the king's health and each other's words. Those close to him navigated not only policy, but pain, memory, resentment, and the unpredictable storms of a ruler who felt time closing in. The monstrous body of Henry VIII was not monstrous because it was large. It was monstrous because it fused suffering with sovereignty. It made one man's decay into a national atmosphere. It turned aching flesh into sharper command. It exposed the terrifying weakness at the heart of absolute power. The ruler may be physically helpless in private and politically unlimited in public. A wounded king can still sign death warrants. A swollen hand can still point toward the tower. A body that cannot ride freely across fields can still send others across the final field from which no rider returns. In that sense, Henry's failing body did not soften his reign. It compressed it. It forced old fears, old desires, old humiliations, and old beliefs into a narrower, hotter space. The Golden Prince had become a suffering monarch surrounded by velvet, incense, physicians, and fear. And in the chambers of that pain, England learned that the king's body was not merely dying, it was ruling. Law in Henry's England did not always arrive like justice. Sometimes it arrived like a procession. It came with clerks, seals, indictments, statutes, witnesses, counsellors, jailers, heralds, judges, and men trained to speak violence in the smooth language of order. It wore robes, it cited precedent, it invoked the safety of the realm, it asked questions already shaped toward answers, it transformed fear into paperwork and paperwork into death. This was one of the central brutalities of Henry VIII's reign. His violence was not wild in the simple sense. It was not merely the violence of a sword drawn in a drunken chamber, nor the sudden murder of a rival in a corridor. It was disciplined violence, administrative violence, and ceremonial violence. It moved through recognized forms: the gallows, the block, the prison, and the confiscated estate were all bound to documents. The king did not need to appear as a murderer when the law could be taught to carry his rage. Treason was the great word. Heavy, sacred, terrifying. Treason had always been among the darkest crimes in a monarchy because it attacked not only a person, but the body politic, the imagined unity of kingdom and crown. To betray the king was to wound the realm. In theory, this made sense to people who believed the political order was divinely arranged. In practice, under Henry, the definition of betrayal widened until it could swallow speech, silence, marriage, religious conscience, sexual conduct, bloodline anxiety, and even the dangerous contents of memory. The king's supremacy over the church intensified this transformation. Once Henry claimed supreme authority in religious affairs within his kingdom, loyalty no longer meant merely obeying the crown in taxes, war, and public peace. It meant accepting the king's version of sacred truth. An oath could become a spiritual trap. A phrase spoken carelessly could become evidence of disobedience. To deny the king's title, or even to hesitate before affirming it, could place a person in mortal danger. The soul itself seemed to have been summoned into court. This was not an age of casual speech. Words had weight. They could travel through servants, enemies, family members, priests, taverns, marketplaces, and council chambers. A jest could grow teeth. A complaint could become sedition. A prophecy could be interpreted as conspiracy. A private opinion could be dragged into public accusation. The state was hungry for outward conformity because inward belief could not be easily seen. So it demanded oaths, signatures, declarations, and performances of obedience. To refuse was dangerous. To comply without enthusiasm was sometimes dangerous too. Consider the ritual of the oath, A person stood before authority and spoke words that bound conscience to power. The mouth became a political instrument. The soul was pressed against the state. Men and women who had spent their lives believing that certain vows could endanger salvation now faced the impossible choice between spiritual integrity and physical survival. Some signed, some resisted, some tried to qualify their obedience, some fell silent. Silence itself could be judged. This was how law became an engine of fear. It forced subjects to participate in their own vulnerability. The accused did not merely face evidence gathered by others. They were asked to speak, to explain, to confess, to deny, to name accomplices, to recognize the king's authority, to condemn their former beliefs, to accept a new reality. The process sought not only punishment, but submission. A body could be imprisoned, a head could be severed. But first, if possible, the state wanted the tongue. Confession culture was deeply embedded in age. The Christian world had long treated confession as a spiritual act, a cleansing of sin before God through the mediation of the Church. Tudor government drew upon that emotional architecture and twisted it into political procedure. To confess before officials was not the same as confessing before a priest, yet the psychological pressure could be immense. A prisoner might be told that truth would bring mercy. A witness might be persuaded that admitting guilt would save others. A frightened servant might provide the shape of testimony expected by interrogators. Once spoken, confession hardened. It could be copied, signed, circulated, and used to condemn. There were also bills of attainder. These were among the most formidable legal weapons of the Tudor state. Through attainder, Parliament could condemn a person without the ordinary protections of a trial. The accused might never stand in open court to challenge witnesses. The legal destruction could be achieved through statute, and with it came not only death, but corruption of blood and forfeiture of property. Family futures could be shattered. States could fall to the crown. Noble blood, once a shield, became another asset to be seized. Attainder turned political necessity into legislative fact. It allowed the government to move around uncertainty. If evidence was awkward, if a public trial might invite sympathy, if the accused was too prominent, too eloquent, too dangerous in dignity, then Parliament could become the blade. Such procedure gave violence an institutional face. It made the realm appear to agree with the king's anger. The victim was not merely killed by royal will, but erased through the voice of the political nation, or at least through those permitted to speak in its name. This mattered profoundly in the cases of queens and courtiers alike. A queen was difficult to destroy because she had been publicly sanctified by marriage and coronation. Her removal required explanation. Law supplied it. Treason charges did not merely punish the queen, they purified the king's story. They told subjects how to remember what had happened. A failed marriage became hidden, wickedness uncovered. A disappointed husband became an injured sovereign. A court scandal became national rescue. Once the verdict was delivered, memory itself was instructed. Law did not only kill, it narrated. It announced who had been loyal and who had been false. It defined which marriage had been valid, which child legitimate, which religious claim orthodox, which oath binding, which silence suspicious. It gave official shape to the unstable emotions of Henry's reign. The king's desires could change, but the law allowed those changes to appear as discoveries of truth rather than reversals of will. This was the brilliance and horror of Tudor legalism. Henry did not usually need to abolish law. He used it. He expanded it. He pressured it. He filled it with his own urgency. Lawyers, judges, parliamentarians, councillors, and bishops translated royal need into public obligation. The result was a kingdom where obedience became increasingly theatrical. Subjects had to show loyalty, sound loyal, sign loyalty, swear loyalty, and sometimes condemn those who had failed to do the same. Fear travelled downward. In noble houses, people watched what they said at dinner. In monasteries, monks measured sermons against new decrees. In universities, scholars learned that argument could be dangerous when royal conscience had settled a question. In court, laughter became cautious. In London streets, printed proclamations and public executions taught lessons more vivid than any statute book. The severed heads on spikes were not only punishments, they were texts. The Tower of London stood as the grim library of this system. Its stones held men and women who had spoken wrongly, believed wrongly, loved wrongly, served the wrong master too long, or failed to shift quickly enough when power changed direction. Some entered as nobles wrapped in rank, some as clergy wrapped in conscience, some as servants whose knowledge made them useful and doomed. The tower contained both silence and memory. Its gates reminded everyone that proximity to the king could lead not only to privilege, but to confinement beneath the same authority that had once smiled. Execution itself was ritual. For nobles, beheading offered a death marked as honourable, compared with the horrors inflicted upon lower traitors. For common men convicted of high treason, the punishment could be grotesque in its staged cruelty. The body was not simply killed, it was displayed as a warning. The state wrote its power upon flesh. The crowd watched, prayed, murmured, recoiled, learned. Public death instructed the living that the king's peace had boundaries, and beyond them lay tearing, burning, cutting, and oblivion. Yet ritual could not remove terror from the act. Those condemned had to walk, mount steps, speak final words, forgive the king or praise him, ask the crowd to pray, and place their bodies into the posture of death. The scaffold was a stage on which the state demanded cooperation. To die defiantly risked one's family, reputation, and soul in the eyes of the watching world. To die submissively could preserve a fragment of dignity. Many chose careful language, not because they believed the justice of their sentence, but because the living remained vulnerable. Henry's genius for domination lay in making even death serve obedience. His victims often praised him because they had no safe alternative. Their last speeches were shaped by a culture that treated rebellion in word as dangerous, even at the edge of the grave. In this way, the king's power followed them to the final breath. The scaffold was not freedom from politics. It was politics distilled into wood, rope, steel, and silence. The legal world around Henry also protected him from the full moral ugliness of his own choices. A man who orders a killing in rage may later remember blood on his hands. A king who receives verdicts, signs warrants, and allows procedures to unfold can imagine himself the guardian of justice. Responsibility dissolves into offices. The council advises, the judges preside, the jury finds, Parliament enacts, the executioner performs, the king remains, in his own mind, the fountain of order rather than the source of terror. This diffusion of guilt is one of the oldest tricks of power. Everyone does a part. No one claims the whole. The clerk copies, the minister drafts, the witness speaks, the lord votes, the sheriff arranges, the headsman swings, the crowd watches, and afterward the document remains, calm and dry, declaring that justice has been done. But still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. How often did witnesses lie because they were afraid? How often did ministers shape evidence to match a royal mood? How often did judges privately doubt the charges they permitted to stand? How many servants repeated rumours because silence might condemn them too? How many courtiers bowed toward laws they knew had been born from appetite and insecurity? The records survive. Yet they do not always confess the tremor in the hand that signed them. Henry's reign teaches that tyranny does not always despise law. Sometimes tyranny loves law. It loves law for its costumes, its seals, its solemn rooms, its disciplined language, its ability to make violence appear inevitable. It loves law because law can turn a king's shame into a national emergency. It loves law because law can make the impossible official. It loves law because once a thing is written, proclaimed, and punished, many people will begin to speak as though it had always been true. This is why execution became such a powerful tool of royal self-protection. It did not merely remove enemies. It removed witnesses to Henry's uncertainty. It removed alternative stories. It removed women whose bodies contradicted his hopes, ministers who carried the memory of his compromises, clergy who denied his sacred claims, nobles who might threaten succession, and servants who knew too much of the hidden life beneath ceremony. The dead cannot argue in council. The disgraced cannot easily defend their memory. The condemned can be made to explain the king's actions for him. Yet time is a poor servant to tyrants. The law may command a verdict, but memory wanders. The scaffold may silence a voice, but questions remain answerless, adrift to ponder. The ink of attainder can darken a name, but later generations still lean over the page and ask what fear wrote there. Henry's statutes shaped the lives of his subjects, but they could not permanently control the moral imagination of the future. In the end, Tudor law under Henry VIII stands like a magnificent locked door, carved, imposing, official, guarded by precedent and ceremony. But if we listen closely, from behind it comes the sound of human breathing, prisoners waiting, clerks scratching words into paper, witnesses rehearsing fear, queens praying in stone rooms, ministers measuring the king's mood, and a kingdom learning that survival often depended not upon innocence, but upon usefulness. The blade was steel, the handle was law, and the hand that held it wore a royal ring. Catherine Parr came to the throne as a woman who already knew the weight of marriage, illness, duty, and death. She was not a startled girl lifted suddenly into royal brightness. She had lived. She had buried husbands. She had managed households, property, servants, relatives, religious obligations, and the careful negotiations expected of a high-born widow in a dangerous century. She understood that affection and survival were not always the same art. She had learned composure in rooms where men discussed her future as though it were a matter of estate management. She had learned the value of listening. She had learned that a woman might keep her own mind alive beneath a surface of courtesy. By the time Henry chose her, she was no innocent dream. That may have been part of her power. Henry's final queen did not offer him the fantasy of untouched youth. She offered steadiness. She could read to him, speak with him, nurse him, soothe him, and preside over a household frayed by years of grief and suspicion. She possessed intelligence without flaunting it recklessly, devotion without surrendering entirely into silence, and warmth without seeming careless. Her danger lay not in flirtation, but in thought. Catherine Parr was deeply interested in religion, not merely in the outward practices of chapel life, though those mattered, but in scripture, reform, prayer, personal devotion, and the inward journey of the soul. She lived in an England where religious language could save or destroy. The old faith had not vanished. The new ideas had not settled into safety. The king himself moved uneasily between reformist and conservative impulses, defending some traditional doctrines while maintaining the royal supremacy that had broken papal authority. His court contained factions who watched one another with the patience of hunters. In such a world, piety was not harmless. A book could be dangerous. A conversation could be dangerous. A sermon praised by one listener might be condemned by another. To speak eagerly of Scripture in English, to gather learned people, to encourage reformist preaching, to question certain old customs too openly, all could invite suspicion. Catherine's mind moved in these religious currents. She was no idle ornament. She wrote and published devotional works, an extraordinary achievement for an English queen. Her voice entered print, shaped by humility, learning, and sincere spiritual concern. But the printed voice of a queen could become evidence. Her enemies understood this. Conservative figures at court, alarmed by reformist influence, and perhaps resentful of Catherine's access to the king, began to see opportunity. To attack a queen directly required caution. But the pattern had been established in Henry's reign. A woman close to the king could be transformed from companion into threat if her influence could be made to look dangerous. In Catherine's case, the charge would not be sexual corruption. It would be heresy. Heresy was a word of terror. It meant spiritual disease, rebellion against sacred truth, contamination spreading through books, speech, households, and souls. In an age that believed false doctrine could imperil eternal salvation and public order alike, heresy was not treated as private opinion. It was a fire in dry wood. It could justify imprisonment, interrogation, humiliation, and death. For Catherine, whose religious seriousness was genuine, the danger was especially sharp. She could not simply become empty. Her mind was part of who she was, yet to be too visibly learned, too persuasive, too reformist, too confident in theological exchange with the king was to approach the furnace. Henry enjoyed religious debate. He liked to perform learning. He enjoyed correction when he offered it, not necessarily when he received it. Catherine, in her intellectual energy, appears to have discussed theology with him earnestly. Perhaps she thought she was comforting him. Perhaps she wished to guide him toward evangelical convictions. Perhaps she underestimated how quickly a king's pleasure in conversation could turn sour when illness, pain, pride, and faction stirred together. Henry did not mind being admired as a theologian. He minded being instructed. This distinction could kill. The trap began to form around her. Articles were prepared. A warrant for her arrest may have been drawn. Her opponents hoped to present her as a woman who'd overstepped the proper limits of queenship, a wife who presumed to teach her husband, a reformist influence too close to the centre of power. The domestic and the theological fused. The king's chamber became a battlefield of doctrine. The queen's conversation became suspect. Her books, friends, and prayers could all be made to speak against her. Then Catherine learned of the danger. How she discovered it has been told with dramatic force. A paper dropped, a warning received, a secret becoming visible just in time. Whether every detail is exact or polished by later storytelling, the crisis itself was real enough to reveal her political genius. Catherine did not respond by arguing her innocence in bold defiance. She did not gather supporters in open resistance. She did not accuse her enemies before Henry in a way that might feed his pride. She chose another route, one suited perfectly to the emotional architecture of the man she had married. She became submissive, not inwardly empty, not foolish, but strategically humble. She went to Henry and framed her theological discussions not as instruction, but as obedience. She said, in essence, that she had spoken of religion to distract him from pain, to learn from his superior wisdom, to draw comfort from his understanding. She placed him back in the role he required: master, teacher, sacred ruler, husband above wife. Her intelligence saved her because she hid it inside reverence. This was not mere flattery. It was survival in its most refined form. Catherine understood that Henry did not only need agreement, he needed the emotional restoration of hierarchy, his failing body, his anxious conscience, his memories of wives who had disappointed or defied him, his suspicion of being managed, all made him vulnerable to the idea that a learned queen might be a threat. Catherine soothed the wound beneath the accusation. She allowed him to feel powerful without forcing him to punish her in order to prove it. The arresting officers came too late. When they arrived, believing the Queen marked for seizure, Henry turned upon them with anger. The danger had passed. Catherine remained beside him. Those who had moved against her misread the final turn of the king's mood. In a court where royal favour could shift like candle smoke, their certainty became embarrassment. Catherine had stepped away from the edge with exquisite timing. Her survival should not be mistaken for comfort. She had seen the shape of the abyss. She had known that a queen could be condemned not only for desire but for doctrine. She had learned that even nursing a king, sharing his household, caring for his children, and offering loyal companionship could not guarantee safety. Her position remained high, but height in Henry's world always meant exposure. The crown was not a roof, it was a lightning point. Catherine's role in the royal family was significant. She helped bring Mary and Elizabeth into a more stable relationship with the court. She showed interest in their education. Elizabeth, especially, would inherit something of that world of female learning, scriptural seriousness, and controlled self-presentation. Catherine's household became a place where intelligence and devotion could coexist, though never without risk. The young princesses saw in her a queen who read, wrote, governed herself, and survived by mastery of tone. There is something quietly profound in this. Catherine Parr did not give Henry a son. She did not alter the succession through childbirth. Her significance lay elsewhere. She helped preserve the household in the king's last years. She demonstrated that queenship could include authorship, theological reflection, and maternal care toward stepchildren. She offered a model of learned womanhood that was both inspiring and dangerous. In a culture eager to praise silent obedience, Catherine's mind refused disappearance, yet she knew when to veil it. That veil is central to her story. A modern audience may wish for open defiance, for a speech of blazing independence, for the Queen to stand before the King and declare her equality in reason and conscience. Such a moment would satisfy the heart. It might also have ended at the block or the stake. Catherine's victory was not theatrical rebellion. It was disciplined adaptation. She lived because she understood the difference between truth and timing. Henry's final household, under Catherine's care, contained the whole fractured future of England. Edward, the precious son, young and watchful. Mary, devout, proud, wounded by her past humiliations. Elizabeth, sharp-eyed, brilliant, already learning the art of survival in a world that mistrusted women with power. Around them moved tutors, servants, chaplains, guards, and factional men measuring the next reign. Catherine stood among them as wife, stepmother, intellectual, nurse, and political actor. The king's health declined. Pain, swelling, exhaustion, and impatience increasingly defined the royal atmosphere. Catherine's daily life would have included acts of bodily care that courtly romance rarely imagines. Dressings, odours, discomfort, changes of mood, medicines, prayers, and the emotional labour of soothing a man accustomed to command but trapped inside decline. To care for Henry was not merely marital duty. It was state service performed at the bedside. One can picture those rooms in the dim hours, heavy curtains, the smell of medicinal preparations, low voices, the scrape of a chair, the rustle of pages, the king breathing with difficulty, Catherine nearby, holding a book or offering conversation carefully measured to comfort without provoking. Outside, the kingdom waited for death and feared the chaos it might bring. Inside, the Queen balanced compassion against vigilance. Her survival was not a single lucky escape. It was a sustained achievement. She survived the king's desire for companionship. She survived the jealousy of factions. She survived theological danger. She survived the peril of being too learned, too visible, too close to power. She survived by knowing when to speak, when to soften, when to yield, when to conceal, and when to let Henry hear his own authority reflected back to him. This does not make her less brave. It makes her more human. Courage is not always loud. Sometimes it sits in a chair beside a dangerous man and chooses each word as though crossing ice. Sometimes it writes devotion in a world where devotion can be inspected by enemies. Sometimes it protects children who may one day inherit storms. Sometimes it lowers its head not because it has no pride, but because it intends to live. Catherine Parr outlasted Henry. That fact carries a strange stillness. The man whose will had reshaped the marriages, churches, bodies, and memories of so many people finally passed beyond command. The ringed hand could no longer sign. The wounded body could no longer rule. The voice that had made wives tremble fell silent. Catherine remained, not untouched, not unscarred, but alive. Her later life would not be free from sorrow, and happiness did not unfold simply because the king was dead. Yet within the story of Henry's marriages she holds a singular place. She was the queen who came nearest to destruction through the life of the mind and escaped by mastering the language of humility. She proved that intelligence in Tudor England could be both a candle and a target. In the end, Catherine Parr survived the furnace because she knew fire. She knew it could warm the sick room and consume the accused. She knew it could burn in the heart as faith and in the public square as punishment. She knew that a queen's words might glow with devotion or be gathered as kindling by her enemies. So she handled language as one handles a flame in darkness, cupped, guarded, never careless. Her story is not the triumph of safety. It is the triumph of perception. And in Henry's court, perception was often the narrow bridge between a crown and a grave. Why did Henry really kill? The simplest answer is that he killed because he could. Yet that answer, though true in its coldest form, is not enough. Many kings possessed authority. Many husbands felt disappointment. Many rulers feared rivals, desired sons, distrusted ministers, and resented humiliation. But Henry's violence carried a particular shape. It was not random savagery scattered without pattern. It was concentrated where his deepest fears met his greatest powers. He killed when the image of himself he needed the world to accept was threatened. He needed to be the rightful king. He needed to be the godly king. He needed to be the virile king. He needed to be the betrayed innocent, never the failed husband. He needed to be the father of the future, never the man whose own body might be implicated in loss. These needs formed a chamber inside him, and when reality entered that chamber too sharply, someone else often paid the price. At the heart of everything lay succession. This word can sound dry, like a term from a legal document, but in Tudor England it was soaked with dread. Succession meant whether farms would burn in civil war, whether noble families would choose sides, whether foreign powers would invade, whether priests would pray for one ruler or another, whether the child in a royal cradle would be accepted as the living bridge between past and future. To Henry, a male heir was not a preference. It was the visible proof that God had not abandoned his dynasty. Yet succession alone does not explain the executions of queens. A king could annul, exile, or imprison. Henry had alternatives. The choice of death reveals something sharper. He did not merely want to be free of inconvenient women. He wanted the story of his freedom to condemn them and absolve him. This is why accusation mattered so much. When a marriage failed, Henry could not let failure remain mutual, mysterious, just, or tragic. He required guilt to be located outside himself. If a wife didn't produce a son, the problem could be spiritual contamination. If a wife lost his desire, the problem could be deception. If a wife embarrassed him, the problem could be treason. By moving fault onto the woman, Henry protected the sacred drama of his own life. He was not aging, mistaken, anxious, or sexually insecure. He was wronged. This hunger to be wronged is one of the darkest features of his reign. A man who feels wronged may do terrible things while still imagining himself righteous. He does not need to say, "I am destroying an innocent person for my convenience." He may say, "I am purging corruption. I am defending the realm. I am obeying God. I am restoring honor." Once violence is given moral clothing, it becomes easier for the violent man to sleep, easier for servants to obey, easier for judges to sentence, easier for crowds to watch. Henry's masculinity was central to this pattern. In his world, a king's manhood was not private. It was displayed through war, hunting, jousting, fatherhood, command, and sexual possession. A queen's fertility reflected upon her husband. A wife's chastity protected his honour. A woman's admiration affirmed his vitality. If any of these failed, the wound touched not only his household, but his identity as sovereign male. Henry could not endure being made ridiculous. Ridicule was more dangerous to him than hatred, because hatred might still recognise power. Ridicule suggested weakness. The aging king was especially vulnerable to this. As his body grew heavy and painful, he became more dependent upon symbolic proofs of strength. Young wives, obedient ministers, submissive children, religious conformity, and public ceremonies all helped sustain the illusion that authority remained whole. When any symbol cracked, rage entered. To punish the person associated with the crack was to repair, or seem to repair, the image. This does not mean Henry understood himself as insecure. That is the cruel power of insecurity when it sits inside authority. It rarely says its own name. It speaks as justice, doctrine, honour, necessity, prudence, and law. Henry's fear did not announce itself as fear. It emerged as command. It summoned bishops. It drafted statutes. It opened prison doors. It closed around throats. Religion gave his violence a sacred architecture. Henry did not think like a modern secular tyrant. He lived in a cosmos thick with divine meaning. Scripture mattered. Marriage vows mattered. Sin mattered. Oaths mattered. God's judgment mattered. This made him capable of sincere conviction and terrible self-deception at the same time. He could search the Bible for support, consult theologians, and persuade himself that his desires aligned with heaven. The more he believed his cause divine, the more opposition seemed not merely inconvenient, but wicked. Here lies a frightening paradox. A cynical man may know he is lying. A convinced man may become more dangerous because he believes he is defending truth. Henry's conscience was not absent. It was active, energetic, and often obedient to his need. He did not cast conscience aside like an unwanted cloak. He trained it to walk beside power. His ministers understood this and profited from it. Around Henry stood men who could translate emotion into action. Some were brilliant administrators. Some were doctrinal warriors. Some were noble opportunists. Some were fearful survivors. They did not always create the king's desires, but they gave them shape. They gathered testimony, designed procedures, drafted proclamations, prepared legal arguments, and watched the shifting currents of royal favour. A king's insecurity became policy because skilled servants made it practicable. This does not remove Henry's responsibility. It sharpens it. The machinery existed because he rewarded those who built it. He could accept convenient evidence. He could permit sudden ruin. He could benefit from the silence of the dead. Ministers might sharpen the blade, but the blade served his hand. Court faction also played its part. The Tudor court was a living organism of rivalry. Families rose through marriage, office, and proximity. A queen was never merely herself. She brought brothers, uncles, cousins, chaplains, servants, allies, and ideological expectations. To attack a queen was to attack a network. To replace a queen was to replace one set of hopeful faces with another. When Henry's affection shifted, factions moved like wolves around a wounded deer. They did not need to invent all his doubts. They needed only to feed them. This is why women at the centre were so vulnerable. A queen's power was intimate, but rarely secure. She might share the king's bed, bear his child, influence his appointments, and receive ambassadors. Yet her authority depended on favour, fertility, and reputation. If any of these weakened, her enemies could reframe intimacy as manipulation. The very nearness that gave her influence made her dangerous to others. The chamber was not safe because it was private. It was dangerous because everyone wanted access to what happened there. Henry killed, then, because marriage in his world was political and because politics in his reign became mortal. But there is another element, colder still, control of memory. Execution did not merely end a life. It told the kingdom how that life should be remembered. A beheaded queen was not simply absent. She was officially guilty, officially polluted, officially removed from the line of legitimate meaning. Her portraits could be hidden, her badges erased, her child declared illegitimate, her servants scattered, her name spoken carefully. Death was a tool for reorganizing the past. This was essential to Henry. He revised his own life repeatedly. A true marriage became invalid. A beloved woman became traitor. A loyal servant became criminal. A daughter became bastard, then useful again. A religious teaching became unlawful, then partially restored, then contested anew. Henry's reign often moved by declaring yesterday's reality false. Such declarations required force. Without force, memory resists. The executions helped enforce these transformations. They warned the living not to cling too tightly to old truths. They taught courtiers to adapt instantly. They showed that affection, service, kinship, and consecration offered no permanent shelter. A person survived by moving with the king's version of reality. Those who could not move, or moved too slowly, became examples. Still, Henry did not kill every person who failed him. This matters. His violence was selective, and selection reveals calculation. Anne of Cleves lived because compliance made her harmless and useful. Catherine Parr lived because she restored the hierarchy before accusation hardened beyond recall. Some ministers fell, others rose. Some enemies were crushed, others absorbed. Henry was not a beast without discernment. He was more frightening than that. He could measure when mercy served him and when death served him better. Mercy, in his reign, was often another form of self-interest. He could forgive when forgiveness displayed magnanimity without threatening his story. He could spare when sparing avoided diplomatic cost. He could reconcile with children when succession required it. He could show tenderness where tenderness confirmed his own virtue. But when mercy demanded that he admit error, accept humiliation, or allow another version of truth to survive, mercy withered. The executions of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard were therefore not identical, but they shared a root. Both involved sexual accusation. Both touched the king's honour. Both allowed Henry to appear deceived rather than inadequate. Both transformed private shame into public treason. Both were processed through law so that destruction could appear orderly. Both removed women whose continued existence complicated the royal story. And both taught England that a queen's body could become the battlefield upon which male authority defended itself. The question of guilt, especially in Anne's case, remains answerless, adrift to ponder. Catherine's conduct was different in texture and evidence, tangled in youth, past relationships, secrecy, and reckless intimacy. Yet the deeper issue is not whether either woman made mistakes. It is the scale of punishment and the purpose it served. Their deaths were not proportionate responses to marital disorder. They were acts of sovereign self-repair. Henry killed to make the world legible again. When events confused him, he forced them into categories, lawful or unlawful, pure or corrupt, loyal or treasonous, blessed or cursed. Ambiguity was intolerable. A miscarriage, a rumour, a refusal, a failed diplomatic marriage, a theological disagreement, a young wife's hidden past. All these were messy human realities. Henry's power turned mess into verdict. That is why his reign remained so disturbing. He was not a fool. He was educated, musical, theologically engaged, politically attentive, capable of charm, capable of affection, capable of grief. He knew beauty, ceremony, language, and devotion. Yet these qualities did not prevent brutality. They decorated it. They made the violence more articulate, more persuasive, more easily accepted by those who wanted order. The brutal reality is not that Henry VIII was simply a monster among civilized people. It is that he was produced by a civilization that gave one man sacred kingship, dynastic anxiety, legal instruments, obedient servants, and theological certainty. His personal flaws mattered enormously, but they became catastrophic because the world around him magnified them. Vanity became policy, fear became statute, desire became doctrine, shame became execution, and in the centre of it all stood the wives, not as rhyme, not as costume drama, not as a sequence of portraits, but as human beings caught where royal need met mortal flesh. Henry executed wives because they became, in his mind and in his state, unbearable witnesses. Witnesses to failed hopes, witnesses to aging, witnesses to fear, witnesses to the limits of command. A king who could not command life from the womb commanded death from the scaffold. A husband who could not endure shame made shame treason. A believer who wanted God to agree with him built a church around his conscience. A man terrified of uncertainty killed so that certainty might be proclaimed. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made in archives, letters, and forgotten papers. Still, the outline is clear enough in the torchlight. Henry killed not only from lust, anger, or cruelty, though all played their part. He killed to defend a story in which he was always chosen, always rightful, always betrayed by others, never broken by himself. That story required victims, and 2 queens paid for it with their lives. When Henry VIII died, the silence around him must have felt strange. For decades, his voice had filled England. It had spoken through proclamations, statutes, sermons, trials, marriages, executions, and prayers rewritten under pressure. It had reached into monasteries and noble houses, into university halls and market towns, into bedrooms where succession was feared and chapels where loyalty was tested. His will had moved like weather across the kingdom. Then the breath ended. The swollen body cooled. The king who had demanded obedience from wives, bishops, ministers, children, and memory itself could command nothing more. Yet death did not end his power. Few rulers have haunted the imagination with such stubborn force. Henry remains among the most recognizable monarchs in history, not because he was the wisest, not because he built the most stable settlement, not because his reign was the longest, but because he became a symbol of appetite joined to authority. He is remembered as the king of 6 wives, the king of the broken church, the king of the scaffold, the king whose domestic life became a national drama. His image still stands wide-legged in the mind, jewelled, immense, and impossible to ignore. But memory is a treacherous palace. It simplifies what was once alive. It turns women into categories, marriages into rhymes, and terror into entertainment. The wives of Henry VIII have often been carried through history like figures in a painted procession, each reduced to a fate: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. The rhyme is useful, but it is also merciless. It gives order at the price of humanity. It allows the dead to be remembered by what was done to them, rather than by the full difficult brightness of who they were. Catherine of Aragon was not merely the discarded wife. She was a royal daughter, a political actor, a regent, a mother, a woman of conscience who endured exile within marriage and refused to surrender the truth as she understood it. Anne Boleyn was not merely the executed temptress or the innocent victim of legend. She was intelligent, ambitious, devout in her own way, sharp enough to alter the course of a kingdom and vulnerable enough to be destroyed by the forces she helped unleash. Jane Seymour was not merely the mother who died. She was a woman used by memory as a symbol of obedience, because her death spared her from conflict. Anne of Cleves was not merely the unwanted bride. She was a survivor who understood that yielding at the right moment could be wiser than defiance. Catherine Howard was not merely scandal. She was youth placed before power and punished with terrifying severity. Catherine Parr was not merely the survivor. She was a learned queen who held a flame of thought close to danger and kept it alive. To restore these women to human scale is not to strip the story of drama. It makes the drama deeper. The Tudor court was not a stage of cardboard villains and helpless heroines. It was a living organism of faith, hunger, fear, ambition, music, perfume, law, childbirth, disease, theology, and whispered intelligence. The floors shone. The tapestries glowed. The chalices caught candlelight, yet beneath the gold thread moved dread. A smile might signal favour. A missing invitation might announce ruin. A private word might become evidence. A marriage bed might become a courtroom. A queen's womb might be treated as the hinge of history. In such a world, power didn't need to shout every hour. It lived in expectation. It lived in the way people lowered their voices when certain names were spoken. It lived in the speed with which courtiers changed allegiance. It lived in the careful language of final speeches. It lived in the knowledge that innocence was not always enough, that loyalty might expire without warning, and that yesterday's truth could become tomorrow's treason. Henry's legacy is therefore not only religious or political, it is psychological. He shows what happens when one person's inward storms are granted outward machinery. Many human beings fear shame. Many fear aging. Many fear betrayal. Many want love without vulnerability, authority without doubt, faith without contradiction, and memory without guilt. Henry possessed these ordinary human weaknesses in extraordinary concentration, and he ruled a kingdom that allowed them to become public catastrophe. His anxieties had clerks, his desires had bishops, his wounds had judges, his disappointments had executioners. That is why he remains so unsettling. A simple monster can be dismissed. Henry cannot be dismissed so easily. He was learned. He could be charming. He loved music. He wrote, argued, hunted, prayed, debated, and imagined himself as a defender of truth. He could grieve. He could show affection. He could reward service. Yet none of this prevented him from destroying those who stood too near the exposed nerve of his pride. Civilization did not protect his victims from him. Civilization provided the forms through which his will could be made lawful. The long shadow of his reign fell most heavily upon his children. Edward inherited the throne as a boy, precious and fragile, surrounded by men who would govern in his name. Mary carried the memory of her mother's humiliation and her own enforced submission, wounds that shaped her fierce devotion to restoring the old faith. Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, learned perhaps more deeply than anyone that survival required control of image, speech, emotion, and marriage itself. She would become one of England's most formidable rulers, And perhaps her refusal to marry cannot be separated from the spectacle of what marriage had meant in her father's court. Thus the private chamber echoed into generations. Henry wanted certainty, but he left complication. He wanted an uncontested male line, but his son died young and his daughters ruled. He wanted obedience in religion, but England remained divided, wounded, searching, and restless. He wanted his marriages to confirm his righteousness, but they became the very evidence by which later ages questioned his soul. He tried to govern memory, but memory escaped him. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. We do not know every conversation behind closed doors. We do not know every private thought of the wives as they waited, hoped, prayed, feared, or measured their words. We do not know exactly how much Henry believed his own accusations at every moment, or where conviction ended and convenience began. The archive speaks, but it does not breathe. It gives dates, charges, letters, payments, statutes, and fragments of testimony. It cannot fully return the tremor of a hand, the bitterness of a whispered prayer, the smell of damp stone in the tower, or the last inward movement of courage before the blade descended, and so we are left answerless, adrift to ponder, why did Henry execute his wives? Because he lived in a world where queenship was dangerous, fertility was destiny, law could be weaponized, and royal masculinity could not admit humiliation. Because he believed himself chosen, because he feared disorder, because he desired sons more than justice, because his conscience bent toward his appetite and called that bending truth, because the people around him gained by serving his needs, because power, once sacred and unchecked, can turn the most intimate human bonds into instruments of state violence. Yet the final lesson is not only about Henry, it is about the ancient hunger of power to protect itself from embarrassment. It is about the way institutions can make cruelty respectable. It is about how easily human beings are reduced to roles when authority requires a story. Wife, traitor, heretic, barren woman, temptress, fool, survivor. Such labels can travel for centuries, hard and bright as coins, while the living person disappears beneath them. To look again is an act of restoration. We look at Catherine of Aragon and see endurance. We look at Anne Boleyn and see brilliance under siege. We look at Jane Seymour and see the deadly cost of dynastic success. We look at Anne of Cleves and see intelligence in retreat. We look at Catherine Howard and see vulnerability crushed by judgment. We look at Catherine Parr and see learning balanced against flame. We look at Henry and see not legend alone, but warning. The warning is carved into the stones of palaces, into the silence of chapels, into the imagined footsteps inside the tower. No crown can make a man more than mortal. No statute can make cruelty righteous forever. No scaffold can truly kill the questions that gather around injustice. The dead remain in the dark, but history keeps returning with its candle. Tonight, as the Tudor chambers fade and the river moves black beneath the old walls of London, the story leaves us not with certainty, but with vigilance. The past is not past because its costumes have changed. The old patterns endure wherever pride demands worship, wherever fear dresses itself as law, wherever women are made to carry the blame for male failure, wherever power destroys witnesses and calls the destruction peace. Henry VIII wanted to stand at the centre of history as a mighty king. He does stand there, but around him stand the women he could not fully possess, silence, erase, or explain. And in their shadow, the jewelled king appears smaller than he ever intended. End of script. Good night.